Hey guys, tonight we slip into a world of saffron-scented corridors, moonlit courtyards, and whispers thick enough to smother a camel. You're not in Kansas anymore. You're in Persepolis, capital of the Achaemenid Empire, the place where sandals shuffle over marble floors and every silk curtain hides a potential assassin. The air is sweet with perfume, heavy with incense, and thick with secrets. As you pass under the velvet drapes into the royal harem, it's clear this is not just a space for pleasure. It's a palace within a palace, a political nerve center pulsing behind golden bars. You probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and what time it is where you are, because I know insomnia has no time zone. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You pad barefoot across the cool tiles, each footstep echoing beneath domed ceilings, painted with celestial scenes. Golden lions chasing ruby-red bulls in an eternal hunt. The harem is not what Hollywood sells you. It's less orgy, more cage match. Dozens of women, each dressed in gauzy finery, move like ghosts, watched constantly by eunuchs, those clipped, silent guardians who smell of myrrh and carry secrets heavier than their weight in gold. And at the top of this gilded food chain floats one woman, Parysatis, Queen Mother, Dowager Empress, Schemer-in-Chief. She sits on cushions that cost more than a soldier's lifetime wage, hands laced calmly over a falcon carved from lapis lazuli. Her eyes don't blink much. That's the first thing you notice. The second. Her presence feels like a blade pressing gently, lovingly, against your throat. Parysatis is no blushing concubine. She was wife to Darius II, mother to 2 royal sons, and a strategist so cold-blooded. Her enemies didn't die in battle. They died in mysterious fevers, foodborne accidents, or tragic stair tumbles. She has outlasted emperors and outmaneuvered generals, armed not with armies, but with cooks, spies, and a steady supply of exotic toxins. Her political philosophy boils down to outlive everyone, outkill the rest. There's a legend that once, after having a noblewoman executed for gossiping, she made the woman's family send thank you notes for the mercy of a quick death. Charming. You pass through another set of veils and find yourself in the chambers of the eunuchs. Those shadowy, shaven-headed figures always lingering on the edges of power. Here, nestled among scrolls, incense burners, and ivory combs, lives Bagoas. If Parysatis is the storm, Bagoas is the eye-calm, controlled, always calculating, born into obscurity, castrated as a child likely during a slave raid, or as part of the brutal court grooming system. Bagoas should have been a forgotten name in a forgotten ledger. But he isn't. Because Bagoas does something dangerous, he listens. Really listens. And he remembers. Everyone's preferences. Everyone's debts. Everyone's weaknesses. And in a court where kings rise and fall faster than you can say immaculate mosaic, that kind of memory is a lethal currency. Historians still argue whether eunuchs like Bagoas had real agency or were just tools of the monarchs. But Bagoas didn't just wield influence, he became a force of his own, a master of subtle manipulation, of perfectly timed tears, of misdelivered messages and accidentally overheard gossip. At night, you might hear him humming old lullabies in Median, his voice soft as falling ash. But don't be fooled. That lullaby once made a general cry and retire early. You sit with him now, watching as he rubs scented oil into his hands, a habit to soothe skin made rough by ink, not labor. He speaks rarely. When he does, it's with that studied softness, each word carved like marble. And above him, a tapestry shows the mythical bird Simur clutching a lion in its talons. A reminder that even beauty can kill. Now look. Left. There's a young soldier stepping into the room. Unarmed, but not unguarded. This is Cyrus the Younger, Parysatis' favorite son. He is handsome, charismatic, and burning with the kind of ambition that scorches everyone around him. He is not the heir his older brother Artaxerxes II wears the crown, but Cyrus has the Queen Mother's blessing, a loyal band of Greek mercenaries, and a plan to change the family hierarchy. He also has Bagoas, not just as a spy, not just as a confidant, but maybe, just maybe, as something more. The details get fuzzy here, because ancient sources can't decide whether their relationship was romantic, manipulative, or merely mutually useful. But it doesn't really matter. The power between them hums like a lyre string pulled too tight. Cyrus leans in, whispering something in Old Persian. Bagoas nods. You can almost feel the air crackle with anticipation. Because this isn't just pillow talk, it's rebellion in silk. Parysatis, watching from her alcove, is silent. She doesn't need to speak. The chessboard is in motion. The pieces are hers. Even her son. Even her eunuch. And you're just watching from the sidelines. For now, you wake. Or maybe never slept. In the cool dawn haze that settles over Susa like a veil too heavy for the sun to lift. The harem quiets, but not for rest. In the Persian court, morning isn't for tea and quiet contemplation. It's for maneuvering. You follow the murmurs through corridors lined with alabaster and gilded tile. Each step a negotiation with silence. Past concubines embroidered in posture and perfume. Past slaves fanning the air as if to beat back the weight of invisible judgment. And into the private quarters of Parysatis. She is already awake. Of course, she probably never sleeps either. Some say her dreams are full of spreadsheets. Others say she doesn't bother with dreams when there's scheming to be done. Her attendants retreat as you approach. Her voice slices the hush like a flint blade. She's dictating orders to who should be watched, who should be sent figs, and who should start coughing mysteriously within the week. You don't even question how she knows so much. She always knows. This woman doesn't rule by decree. She rules by implication. A frown here, a subtle smile there. And suddenly, an admiral finds himself reassigned to a particularly shark-infested coastline. Born to nobility, married off to Darius II at a young age, Parysatis quickly proved herself more than ceremonial arm candy. She was his counselor, his political fixer, and, according to some sources, the reason several of his opponents died under circumstances that were, shall we say, extremely coincidental. There's even a whispery rumor that she had a hand in the death of Darius himself, but that's probably just palace gossip, unless it isn't. Historians still argue whether Parysatis acted out of loyalty to her son Cyrus or pure thirst for power. Either way, she wasn't one to let the throne slip away gently, not without scratching, biting, and probably poisoning someone on the way down. You trace her rise through the polished halls of bureaucracy. She understood early that power wasn't just in armies or treasury accounts. It was in kitchens and laundries and scroll-copying rooms. She had eyes everywhere. She befriended eunuchs, cooks, bath attendants, and scribes, anyone with access, and no illusions about loyalty. One of her favorite tools, oison, not in dramatic doses, but in whispers, slow acting, undetectable to all but the most paranoid. A little in the wine, a little in the stew, maybe not enough to kill, just enough to unnerve. Let people fear their figs. Let them question their pomegranate juice. That was Parysatis' method, psychological warfare wrapped in rosewater. Take, for instance, the tale of her rival. Statera, the wife of Artaxerxes II, and therefore, by default, the woman Parysatis liked least. At one of those performatively polite royal banquets, where smiles are knives and gossip is more dangerous than steel, Parysatis allegedly arranged for a delicacy grilled bird, shared between the queen mother and the new queen. But plot twist, Parysatis had prearranged that only the half served to Statera would be laced with death. It worked. Statera died in public, gasping like a beached fish, while musicians kept playing. When the king wept, Parysatis simply dabbed at her lips with a cloth and said something about how fragile beauty is. But Parysatis wasn't just about vengeance. She was strategic. Her support of her younger son Cyrus wasn't maternal. It was mathematical. Artaxerxes was weak, indecisive, and overly pious in her view. Cyrus was the blade she'd been sharpening for years, groomed in military command, trained by the finest Greek tutors. Cyrus was bold, calculating, and slightly unhinged, in other words. Everything a real king should be. Parysatis didn't just back him politically. She bankrolled his ambitions, lobbied generals, and strategically manipulated court factions to isolate Artaxerxes. She used religion, too, recasting Cyrus as the champion of true Zoroastrian values, though her personal belief in any god probably ranked somewhere below her belief in leverage, and at the center of it all, Bagoas, the eunuch who served both mother and son, who slipped messages between their chambers, who arranged secret audiences and intercepted dangerous scrolls. He was their bridge, their whisper conduit, and perhaps the only person both trusted completely. His own ambitions were harder to read. He never raised his voice. He never forgot a name. He once orchestrated the fall of a nobleman by circulating just enough copies of a poem mocking Artaxerxes to create suspicion, then claimed credit for exposing it. That's the kind of man he was. Not a sword swinger, a chess player, a long game believer. By now, you're standing in the corridor that links the Queen Mother's quarters to the Hall of Records, where Bagoas often loiters under the pretense of reviewing court etiquette manuals. Today, he's not reading. He's waiting. Cyrus arrives, cloaked, no guards. They exchange a look. You wouldn't catch it if you blinked, but you didn't. There's something intense there. Trust, certainly. Dependency, possibly more. The two disappear into a side chamber, and you don't follow. Not because you aren't curious, but because you know that what happens in that room is less important than what will happen in its aftermath. This is where the real game begins. Parysatis isn't just watching the empire. She's planting it, pruning it, and preparing to reap. And like any proper gardener of empires, she knows when to let something grow wild. Cyrus's rebellion is a risk, but it's also an opportunity. And Bagoas, he's the gardener's glove. Quiet, nimble, immune to thorns. He doesn't need a title. He has proximity. And in Persia, proximity is the sharpest blade of all. You're still in the shadows when Bagoas emerges again. Smooth as mercury, unreadable as ever. He's not flashy. There's no dramatic robe sweep or villainous monologue. But if you watch him long enough, you'll see how rooms seem to react to him. People fall quieter. Eyes track him, even when they pretend not to. This is not fear exactly, more like unease, wrapped in silk. He carries himself like someone used to cleaning up messes no one dares mention. And behind that soft-spoken presence, behind the scented oils and the precisely arranged curls, there's a truth harder than marble. Bagoas is a survivor, and survival in this empire, that takes work, not just cunning, but endless effort. He isn't born into privilege. He's created it, one strategic alliance and one eliminated threat at a time. To understand Bagoas, you have to rewind. Not to his birth, we don't know where or when exactly he entered the world. That's part of the mystery. Some say he was born in Babylonia, others in Media. Some say he was captured as a child during one of those civilizing raids. The kind where soldiers claim to be restoring order, but mostly just burn villages and take whatever or whoever they want. What we do know is that Bagoas was selected more likely seized for the palace eunuch program. And yes, that's a thing. The Achaemenid Empire, like many ancient empires, trusted eunuchs to serve in positions of great intimacy and power. The reasoning was brutal and simple. No family meant no dynasty. A eunuch couldn't father heirs, which meant he couldn't start a rival faction. It made him safe, at least in theory. But here's where the system underestimates people like Bagoas. Because when you strip someone of legacy, of biology, of possibility, you sometimes end up creating a human weapon, one whose only loyalty is to survival, one who learns how to navigate not just rooms, but people, one who becomes indispensable because of his ability to be invisible. Bagoas knew how to pass between circles, servant to the chambermaids, confidant to queens, errand boy to the scribes, and later, something much more dangerous. He was the guy who remembered how you liked your dates, who noticed when you started skipping meals, who could recite your lineage back 3 generations, and use it against you. He wasn't feared like a general. He was feared like a rumor that refuses to die. And the higher he climbed, the more indispensable he became. He knew which courtier had gambling debts. He knew which foreign ambassador was discreetly meeting a poet every 3rd night. He knew which dishes caused unfortunate intestinal upsets, useful when you needed someone out of commission, but not, permanently. This is how Bagoas earned the trust of both Parysatis and Cyrus. Not because he was loyal, but because he was terrifyingly competent. He didn't miss things. And in a court where missing a name, a whisper, or a side glance could get you demoted, exiled, or beheaded, that kind of competence becomes holy. Historians still debate how close Bagoas and Cyrus really were. Some ancient sources suggest they were lovers. Others frame it more like a mentorship or a cold alliance born of mutual ambition. But it's not really about love in the modern sense. You don't have heart-to-hearts in the Achaemenid court. You have leverage. You have alignments. You have shared secrets wrapped in enough velvet to pass as affection. And Bagoas, he gave Cyrus access to information, to Parysatis, to parts of the palace that could not be entered with swords alone. He also offered something Cyrus didn't know he needed: subtlety. For all his charisma, Cyrus was not subtle. He preferred bold gestures, dramatic speeches, and glorious plans that involved a lot of charging. Bagoas was the shadow to that light, the one who whispered, "Let's not kill that advisor just yet." Or, "Maybe don't insult the Babylonian priests this week." So it made sense that when Cyrus began building his rebellion, he didn't do it alone. He had Greek mercenaries. Yes, rough men with big swords and bigger egos. imported from across the Aegean for their martial prowess. But he also had Bagoas, who worked the palace like a spider webbed in gold. One of Bagoas's biggest early achievements, recruiting, or rather, nudging the right generals into Cyrus's orbit. He sent them gifts, flattered their wives, hinted at Parysatis' favor, and slowly, men who had no business backing a second son started declaring loyalty. Why? Because they trusted Bagoas, or feared him, or both. There's a bizarre little anecdote about this period. Apparently, during a royal feast, Bagoas was assigned to oversee the wine service, a ceremonial role usually beneath him. But instead of pouting, he used it as an opportunity to control who got which vintage, how strong the pours were, and how many refills people received. By the end of the night, the pro-Cyrus faction had been toasted into solidarity, while Artaxerxes' backers were too drunk to remember their own arguments. Coincidence, maybe. Genius, definitely. And yet, even as he gained influence, Bagoas remained formally powerless. He held no title that would impress the scribes. No lands, no army, no children. In the records, he appears like a whisper between lines, which is exactly how he wanted it. Because whispers don't get assassinated. Whispers don't get blamed. Whispers suraba. At night, he walked the gardens alone, watched the flaming torches reflect in the shallow pools, and listened to the rustling of palm trees like a warning. He was always calculating, always waiting, and when people tried to provoke him, those who mocked his voice or sneered at his past, he smiled. Politely. Days or weeks later, those same critics would find their tax audits suddenly failing, or their letters intercepted and misquoted in court. One noble who called him the clipped cat at a banquet was reassigned to a garrison near the Bactrian frontier, a post famous for its wolves, scorpions, and total absence of anyone who mattered. Bagoas never raised his voice. He didn't have to. You watch him now, sitting by a reflecting pool as a falcon shrieks somewhere overhead. He dips his fingers into the water absently, the surface breaking in slow ripples. Nearby, a courtier drops a scroll and freezes, unsure whether to retrieve it or flee. Bagoas just gestures, wordless. The scroll is returned. Life continues. And somewhere in the background, the machinery of rebellion clicks forward, tooth by gilded tooth. Because while the empire sees Cyrus as the rebellion's head, those who know better understand the truth. Bagoas is the spine. He's the one keeping the body upright. And when the time comes, he'll decide where it bends or breaks. You're no longer in the perfumed warmth of Susa. The air is drier now, sharper. You feel it catch in your throat, as if the sand itself is watching. The whispers have become orders. The gestures have become marches. Cyrus is on the move. And you, along with the rest of this imperial soap opera, are heading straight into the jaws of Mesopotamia. Bagoas doesn't wear armor. He wears information. But make no mistake, he's at war. Cyrus's rebellion has evolved from a parlor conversation into a logistical juggernaut. His army is strange. A Frankenstein's monster of elite Persian troops and nearly 10,000 Greek mercenaries, mostly veterans from the Peloponnesian War. Battle-hardened and sorely underpaid. They're professional, unpredictable, and deeply suspicious of everything not soaked in olive oil. What could possibly go wrong? You ride at the back of the train. The dust clouds churn behind the endless lines of camels, carts, and sweating soldiers. It smells like leather, metal, and mild regret. You pass Persian nobles trying to look brave while clearly missing their wine cellars, and Greek hoplites laughing at everything in sight because they're convinced the Persians are too soft to fight. But it's Bagoas you keep watching. He doesn't laugh, doesn't complain. He just observes. When rations run short, he notices who shares and who hoards. When rumors spread, he traces their source. He has his own network now, servants, cooks, scouts people who owe him favors or fear what happens if they don't. At night, the camp is a chaotic blend of languages and tension. You hear Greek curses and Persian prayers. You see mercenaries playing dice while generals huddle over maps lit by flickering torchlight. In the largest tent, Cyrus plans. He believes victory is certain. He believes his brother Artaxerxes will collapse like a soggy fig at the first sign of resistance. He believes the gods are with him. Bagoas says little, only occasionally interrupting with a word or a cough when Cyrus overlooks something crucial like how far water sources actually are, or which noble is quietly corresponding with the other side. But the prince listens, always, and yet, the cracks are starting to show. Some Greek commanders don't trust Cyrus. They wonder if he's underpaying them, or if they'll ever see their home again. One particularly loud Spartan keeps asking why they're marching into an empire-sized hornet's nest just because a Persian royal had a bad sibling rivalry. Bagoas hears it all. He doesn't silence the dissenters. He files them away. Information is a sword he never has to sharpen, just wield. There's a moment almost cinematic when Cyrus calls the commanders together for a feast. It's a gesture meant to unite them, to calm the storm. The tent is decked out like a mobile palace, with gold-threaded rugs, wine from Syria, honeyed meats, and dancers swaying like reeds in river fog. Everyone pretends to relax. But Bagoas is watching one man in particular, a Greek named Clearchus, a mercenary leader with too much pride and not enough subtlety. Bagoas has been feeding him flattery, letting him believe he's in control, that his opinions matter, that he'll be the kingmaker in the new regime. Clearchus eats it up like roast lamb, literally and figuratively. Historians still argue whether Bagoas's manipulation of Clearchus was part of a larger strategy or just personal insurance. Either way, it works. The mercenaries stop complaining. For now, they're marching again the next morning, deeper into Babylonian territory, with the Tigris whispering nearby and vultures circling overhead, not for the dead, but for the promises being broken every mile. This is not a triumphant march. This is an increasingly expensive gamble being financed by dreams, lies, and a few very stubborn people. Then comes Cunaxa, the battle, the big one, or at least the one that's supposed to change everything. The sun rises over the flat plain, blinding and pitiless. Cyrus lines up his forces, Greeks on one flank, Persians on the other. Bagoas, not a warrior by any stretch, is somewhere behind the lines, coordinating messages, making sure the right captains have their final instructions, double-checking loyalties. He's prepared for many outcomes, except the one that actually happens. Cyrus, in a moment of chaotic bravery or ego, rides straight into the thick of the enemy line to strike at his brother. He does, in fact, wound Artaxerxes. But then, a javelin, one thrown by a royal guard, one nobody saw coming. It punches through Cyrus's chest. He dies quickly, or maybe slowly. The sources are fuzzy. What matters is that Hades, and suddenly, everything Bagoas built unravels. The Greeks win their part of the battle, hilariously unaware their employer is dead. They celebrate. Then, hours later, the truth hits. The Persians are leaderless. The rebellion is leaderless. And Bagoas, he is alone. For a moment, time freezes. The tents are still. The river flows on, uncaring. The birds, the ones that always seem to know, begin circling lower. You'd think this would be the end for Bagoas. No title, no allies, no royal patron, just a camp full of foreign soldiers and a very angry king on the way. But Bagoas is not a candle in the wind. He's the wind. That night, he doesn't run. He doesn't panic. He begins quietly dismantling. He burns certain scrolls. He pays off a scribe to fake travel orders. He sends a messenger to a minor governor with a bribe and a plea for temporary sanctuary. He plays weak, just another frightened servant lost in the chaos. Nobody suspects. Nobody sees the storm still coiled behind his eyes. In a detail so absurd, it almost feels like a script note from a bad drama. Bagoas allegedly arranges for Cyrus's body to be retrieved and honored. Even in failure, he understands the importance of narrative. If Cyrus dies like a hero, maybe his supporters don't get executed immediately. Maybe someone remembers who stayed loyal. Maybe one day, someone new will rise and need a man like Bagoas. And so, as the battlefield is cleared, as mercenaries pack up their trauma and go marching back toward the sea, you catch a last glimpse of Bagoas near the Tigris. He's kneeling, not praying, just thinking, resetting the game board. And behind him, the sun dips blood red into the horizon. Tomorrow, he'll start again. Because for Bagoas, failure is just another kind of disguise. You return to Susa, or rather, Susa returns to you like a cold whisper through the back of your mind. The city hasn't changed, but the silence feels heavier. The air is filled with that brittle tension people get when they know someone is about to die, but haven't decided who deserves it most. Cyrus is gone. His body's been buried, probably with 100 lies and 1,000 regrets. His Greek mercenaries, what's left of them, are trudging back across Mesopotamia, their pockets lighter, and their trust in Persian royalty completely annihilated. Artaxerxes II, the elder brother, the legitimate king, now walks a little taller. He survived. Technically. But victory has a bitter taste when your brother almost dethrones you with a band of foreign hirelings and your own mother funded it. That's right. Parysatis, the queen mother, the one who used to plan state policy between dessert courses, is in the deepest political cold since Medes learned not to trust warm wine. She's no longer sitting on her embroidered cushions, surrounded by whispering attendants. She's under house arrest. The imperial version of timeout, but with more guards and fewer snacks. You'd think this would be the end for her, that the woman who orchestrated an entire civil war against her own son would finally be neutralized. But no, Parysatis does what she's always done. She waits, she smiles, she pretends to reflect, and behind her eyelids, she plots. Her son can exile her. He can remove her titles. But she knows him. She raised him. And more importantly, she knows his weaknesses, his vices, and every embarrassing moment of his adolescence. The empire may be big, but nothing travels faster than a mother's judgment. Artaxerxes tries to solidify his rule. He purges suspected traitors, throws parties that feel more like interrogations, and gives speeches about divine favor. But he knows the court is still riddled with Cyrus sympathizers, some open, some quiet, and a few so embedded you'd need a spiritual X-ray to find them. And among those quiet ones, back from the dead in all but name, is Bagoas. He didn't die on the battlefield. He didn't get crucified with the mercenaries. He didn't even get demoted. He just disappeared for a while. He slipped into obscurity, changed his routes, let the dust settle. And then, slowly, he returned. Not to the harem this time, but to the bureaucratic underbelly of the court. You find him now managing correspondence for minor satraps, arranging ceremonial timetables, auditing temples, mundane work, safe work. But under the radar, he's rebuilding, a favor here, a secret there, every time a courier thanks him for a quiet recommendation, every time a noble gets promoted after seeking his advice. Bagoas grows. He isn't trying to shine. He's laying groundwork. Fungus grows in the dark, and so do empires within empires. Parysatis notices. Of course she does. One afternoon, under the pretense of reviewing her linens because even exiled queen mothers are allowed to be fussy about thread counts, she arranges a private conversation. They don't hug. They don't smile. They just lock eyes for a moment too long. And then she nods, barely perceptibly. She knows. He knows. The game isn't over. It just needed new pieces. The court around them is distracted. There's a new Egyptian revolt. Some satraps are embezzling again. The treasury's been mysteriously short for 3 months in a row. And the king's popularity, not great. Turns out surviving your brother doesn't make you beloved. It just makes you next in line for disappointment. And Parysatis. She starts inviting people over. Quiet people. Old allies. Widows of generals who died mysteriously. Ex-lovers of satraps who accidentally offended Cyrus. She plays host. She serves wine. The exact type of wine people get nervous about drinking. There's a dinner. Not a big one. Just a dozen guests, including some minor nobles, an astrologer who used to advise Darius, and a chef who once cooked for the rebels, and Bagoas. He doesn't speak much, but he watches who eats what, who pretends to sip, who tries to swap plates when no one's looking, and he takes notes, mentally. The next week, 2 of the guests leave for the provinces. One dies of a sudden fever. The astrologer, promoted. The chef, now running a palace kitchen again. Coincidence? You already know better. Historians still argue whether Parysatis' rehabilitation was orchestrated by Bagoas, or whether she clawed her way back on her own. Either way, by year's end, she's no longer under house arrest. She's back attending ceremonies, making loud opinions about military budgets, and surprise hosting religious festivals again. And Artaxerxes, he allows it. Not because he's forgiven her, but because he realizes the terrifying truth he needs her. His rule is fragile, his enemies are many, and his own charisma wouldn't light a torch in a fireworks factory. Parysatis might be venomous, but she's also efficient, and loyalty, in this palace, is measured less by love and more by results. She brings results. So does Bagoas. Together, they start cleaning house. Subtly. Carefully. Some former Cyrus supporters are pardoned. Publicly. Others vanish. Quietly. A few are framed for unrelated scandals. One noble is accused of hoarding saffron, meant for temple rituals. Another is discovered to have falsified grain records. Bagoas handles the investigations. He has a gift for paperwork. And by gift, we mean an uncanny ability to make documents appear or disappear, depending on whose head is on the chopping block. There's a popular saying around court that year. If Bagoas writes your name, start writing your will. People chuckle nervously when they say it, but they don't say it when he's near. His name becomes an adjective, Bagoasian, used to describe anything that's elegant, terrifying, and weirdly efficient. A dagger with a velvet hilt is very Bagoasian, a perfectly timed scandal. Bagoasian, a marriage proposal that doubles as political blackmail. Classic Bagoas. But don't let the memes fool you. He isn't operating alone. He's still tethered to Parysatis. She's the engine. He's the oil. She provides the old grudges. He finds the new tools. And Artaxerxes, stuck in the middle, tolerates it. Because for all his resentment, he knows that without them, he'd already be dethroned or worse. Irrelevant, the weirdest part. There's a strange affection in this triangle. Twisted, yes. Dysfunctional, absolutely. But real. Parysatis praises Bagoas publicly, calling him my most efficient memory. Artaxerxes gives him ceremonial gifts, brooches, robes, even a ring that once belonged to a defector. And Bagoas. He returns the favor by not letting them die. Or at least, not yet. He's not loyal in the traditional sense. He's loyal like gravity, predictable, inexorable, dangerous when ignored. One afternoon, you find Bagoa standing alone on the palace balcony, watching the city churn. Below, the people still go about their lives buying fish, arguing over taxes, getting distracted by temple parades. They don't know him. Most couldn't even pick him out of a lineup. But he knows them. He knows which district is behind on tithes, which guilds are loyal, which priests are corruptible. He isn't a king. He doesn't want to be. He wants to be the reason kings survive, or the reason they don't. The days grow longer in the imperial court, but time feels slower, dragged down by the weight of secrets and the slipperiness of trust. You're still there, observing from behind painted screens and embroidered tapestries, and you can feel the empire shifting. Parysatis is back to doing what she does best, poisoning conversations with a smile. Artaxerxes sits on his throne, increasingly suspicious of anyone who seems too confident. And Bagoas thrives. He doesn't just survive political storms, he predicts the rainfall, sells the umbrellas, and then buys up the ruined estates when the floods come. He's everywhere and nowhere. 1 minute, he's supervising a temple inventory. The next, he's overseeing an architectural project at a military fort. No one's quite sure what his job title is anymore. They just know that when he enters a room, conversations change. Eyes lower. Wine is left untouched. And then, just when the court seems to settle into its usual rhythm of lies, bribes, and badly rehearsed loyalty, Parysatis makes a move so bold you almost drop your goblet. She starts pushing for Cyrus's memory to be rehabilitated. Not fully, of course. Not let's build a statue and have a parade levels of absolution, but subtle gestures. She begins referring to him in public prayers again. She praises his bravery in court banquets. She donates money to the temple where his favorite priest once served. This is dangerous, blasphemous, even, and Artaxerxes knows it. But instead of condemning her, he hesitates. Maybe because he still fears her. Maybe because, deep down, he wonders if she's right that Cyrus would have made a stronger king. Or maybe he's just tired. Ruling is exhausting, especially when your own mother is gaslighting the entire court while sipping saffron tea. And in the middle of all this, Bagoas, watching from the side, playing both ends like a master musician, coaxing harmony from chaos. He doesn't publicly support the Cyrus nostalgia movement. He just ensures that those who do aren't immediately imprisoned. a word here, a scroll misplaced there. His influence isn't overt, it's atmospheric. And then, something strange happens. Artaxerxes begins consulting him more directly, not just for ceremonial tasks or gossip control, but for policy, foreign diplomacy, military logistics. The king has advisors. Yes, but they are nobles, tied to clans, interests, grudges. Bagoas is unencumbered. He has no family name to disgrace, no estate to seize. He exists within the system, but is owned by no one. That makes him dangerous and invaluable. It starts with small questions. Should we trust this Egyptian envoy? Is the Babylonian priesthood getting too powerful then? Bigger ones, what happens if the Greeks return? Can we trust the satrap of Sardis each time? Bagoas answers with precision and detachment. He's not guessing. He's already run simulations in his head, anticipated variables, and Artaxerxes, whether he admits it or not, starts depending on those answers. This is when the power shift begins. Quiet, but seismic. The king is still the king, but the court is starting to orbit around a eunuch. Historians still argue whether Bagoas had actual administrative power, or whether his influence was more behind the scenes. What's clear is that people began coming to him before they went to the king. Petitioners would try to bribe him. Generals would request his blessing before proposing plans. Even foreign envoys started learning a few words of Median, just to flatter him in passing. One ambassador from Phoenicia reportedly gifted him a pair of leopard cubs, hoping to win his favor. Bagoas accepted the gift, and then convinced Artaxerxes to delay a treaty with Phoenicia by 6 months. The cubs given to a minor noble whose son had recently recovered from illness. A gesture of goodwill, Bagoas said, knowing full well it would earn him 2 new loyal families. That's how he operated, turning favors into networks. Networks into leverage. Parysatis, for her part, watches this rise with a mixture of pride and calculation. She knows Bagoas is powerful now. Too powerful, perhaps. But she also knows something else. He's still tethered to Cyrus's ghost. Whether out of guilt, love, or some combination only he understands. Bagoas hasn't let go of the past, and so she lets him climb, because his climb keeps her son's memory alive, even if no one dares say it out loud. There's a moment that year small, but telling when Parysatis falls ill. Real illness this time. No poison, no dramatic fainting, just age. Bagoas stays by her side for 2 days, refusing all duties. When she recovers, she gives him a ring. Not gold, not royal, just a simple stone carved with the symbol of Ahura Mazda. Protection, perhaps gratitude, perhaps a reminder. Meanwhile, the court begins reshaping itself around the new hierarchy. Bagoas starts appointing his own assistants. He drafts legal reforms to streamline tax collection. He oversees rebuilding projects in cities affected by rebellion. His name appears in administrative logs with increasing frequency, often just as the royal agent. No one dares challenge it. The few who do well, let's just say their careers wither. One ambitious noble tries to accuse him of overstepping, claiming that a man without a lineage should not steer the ship of state. That noble is later found guilty of accounting errors and quietly exiled. Coincidence only if you believe in fairy tales. And then comes the banquet, a massive one. Artaxerxes wants to celebrate the 10th anniversary of his reign. There's music, dancers, fireworks imported from India, and a feast so elaborate it requires its own annex. Nobles from across the empire are summoned. Toasts are made. And then, shockingly, the king stands and makes a speech. In it, he praises his mother. Briefly, carefully. But he also names Bagoas as a protector of peace and friend of truth. That's not just praise. That's a signal. That's the kind of phrase that gets carved into stelae, that gets remembered in priestly chronicles, that gets whispered for generations. You're there, watching as Bagoas bows, says nothing, and returns to his seat. He doesn't smile. He doesn't gloat. He just lifts his cup filled, notably, with water and drinks. Around him, murmurs begin. Some nobles applaud. Others seethe. But all understand what just happened. A eunuch, a man who entered the court with no family, no prospects, no identity, has become the most powerful non-royal figure in the empire. And he did it without raising a sword. After the feast, as torches flicker and servants clear the remains of roasted lambs and jewel-studded desserts, Bagoas lingers in the hall alone. He walks past the columns painted with scenes of kings conquering lions, past inscriptions meant to glorify royal bloodlines. He stops at one pillar, where the story of Darius is carved, a story that began long before him, but somehow feels connected. He places a hand on the stone, not reverently, just thoughtfully. You can almost hear him thinking empires forget. Statues crumble. But influence survives in the spaces between stories, and Bagoas has become the master of those spaces. There's something strange about watching history try to forget someone in real time. You see it in the way courtiers lower their voices when they say his name, or how official scribes suddenly leave blanks in otherwise detailed records. Bagoas, for all his invisible elegance, is becoming too visible. Power tends to glow, even when it's worn like perfume, and people in the Persian court have an allergy to those who shine too brightly without royal blood to back it up. But Bagoas doesn't panic. He never does. He simply shifts, adjusts his posture in the great game, bends the light just enough to look like furniture again. Historians still argue whether Bagoas was truly in love with Cyrus or simply used his death as a kind of political battery, charging himself with the legacy of a fallen prince. What we know is this, that his loyalty didn't die with Cyrus. It mutated. It latched onto survival, and then it adapted to thrive. And now, as whispers of jealousy curl through the marble halls, Bagoas begins to work in a new register, something colder, quieter, almost religious in its precision. You see him now, gliding through the palace like a shadow with a memory. He nods to servants, chats with junior scribes, praises cooks for spices he pretends to recognize. But beneath that surface, something is coiling. He's looking for leverage, because he knows what's coming. People are growing bold. Not openly, but you don't need to shout to start a rebellion in Persia. All you need is a rumor, repeated just right. And suddenly, there's one circling that Bagoas is whispering policy directly into the king's ear, bypassing the council, bypassing the generals, that he's controlling appointments, that he's tampering with rituals, that maybe he's even, well, there's the wild one that he's angling to replace the king entirely. It's ridiculous, but ridiculous is never harmless. Not when it comes with wine-stained breath and convenient timing. So Bagoas shifts tactics. He starts making himself useful to people who dislike him. He accidentally solves problems for them. One satrap finds that a rival's caravan mysteriously gets stuck in customs. Another discovers his taxes were overpaid by accident, of course, and receives a refund with a polite note from Bagoas's office. It's like a campaign of reverse sabotage. Make them question why they hate you. Make them worry that opposing you might mean losing the most efficient fixer in the empire. At the same time, he begins to cultivate a new narrative, one built not on Cyrus, but on something bigger, on the empire itself. He starts using phrases like, "for the good of Persia," and "in service of harmony." He supports temple renovations, funds city repairs, patronizes minor poets who write flattering odes to Zoroastrian unity. And slowly, subtly, he shifts from being a man who served a prince to a man who serves the realm. Meanwhile, there's a shift in his relationship with Artaxerxes. The king, now older and more cautious, relies on Bagoas like a man uses a cane begrudgingly, but with a growing dependence he refuses to admit. He begins meeting with Bagoas privately more often, consulting him on matters not even the high priests are allowed to hear. At one point, when a rebellion flares in the western provinces, Bagoas is given command not of troops, but of strategy. He drafts the response, arranges the bribes, ensures the rebellion dies before it even becomes a headline, and Artaxerxes publicly thanks him. The nobles smile. They nod. But inside, you can feel them fuming. A eunuch solving military crises. That's not just unconventional, it's insulting to the families who've spilled blood for generations. And yet, they can't stop him. Every attempt to discredit Bagoas fails. One noble accuses him of financial misconduct. Bagoas provides not only the correct receipts, but also proof that the noble himself misappropriated temple funds 2 years ago. Another arranges for a spiritual vision claiming Bagoas offends the gods. Unfortunately for them, Bagoas had already donated heavily to the same temple's repairs last season. The high priest calls him a friend of the divine flame. You almost feel bad for his enemies. Almost. But beneath this growing empire of influence, Bagoas begins to show signs of something else: fatigue. Maybe. Or grief. You start to notice how often he visits the library at night, reading alone by oil lamp. He requests a copy of a poem written in Cyrus's honor. He commissions a private shrine not dedicated to Cyrus directly, but to a fallen hero whose dream was peace. Only a few understand the reference. One of them is Parysatis. She visits the shrine once, leaves no offering, just sits, and when she rises, her hands tremble. Just slightly. The strange thing is, for all his power, Bagoas remains an outsider. He's never invited to noble hunting parties. He never marries. He never inherits lands. There are no songs about him in the popular marketplace. To the common people, he's just a name, one wrapped in rumors and myths, but not one they can picture. He has no dynasty, no sons to take up his mantle. His legacy is in systems, not statues. It's bureaucratic immortality, which is a lot less glamorous but far more stable. One day, he receives word that a satrap he once protected has died. Old age, nothing dramatic, but in his will, the man left Bagoas a small estate near the river, an orchard, some vineyards. Bagoas visits it once. He walks among the trees, picks a fig, says nothing, then sells it. Too risky to appear sentimental, too dangerous to be seen as building a power base. And yet, there's one more layer to the story. Bagoas, despite all odds, begins to attract imitators. Young eunuchs who emulate his manner, officials who study his style of administration, even nobles who begrudgingly admit that he's effective. He becomes a genre, a mood, a standard. You hear whispers like, "Handle it the Bagoas way," or "We need someone with Bagoas-level subtlety." In an empire that still refuses to put his name on monuments, he becomes the most referenced man in imperial shorthand. At night, back in his quarters, Bagoas writes, "We don't know what, No scrolls survive. Maybe it's just lists. Maybe it's letters never sent. But sometimes he burns them. Not angrily, just precisely. As if he's editing a legacy he knows the scribes will never get right. You watch the ash curl into the lamplight, and you wonder, is this man trying to control how he's remembered, or simply ensuring he's not remembered at all? Because here's the uncomfortable truth. For all his influence, for all his proximity to power, Bagoas remains a ghost in the official histories. A footnote, a curiosity, a eunuch. But in these walls, in these echoing halls of scented politics and velvet-wrapped ambition, he is the architect, the whisperer, the one who changed everything, and then stepped aside before the applause. The empire doesn't pause, not for grief, not for legacy, not even for an eclipse. And as the months roll into years, the slow-moving leviathan of Persian politics grinds forward, reshuffling titles, rebuilding temples, reassigning satraps, as if everything is stable, as if the ground isn't always just one heartbeat from rupture. You're still following Bagoas, though by now it feels less like observing and more like orbiting. He moves through the court with the quiet confidence of a man who knows not only where all the bodies are buried, but also who dug the holes, who ordered the digging, and who will be digging the next ones. But for all the stability he helps enforce, Bagoas is about to be swept into a much larger storm. One forged not in whispers or scrolls, but in boot leather and steel. Because far to the west, in lands beyond the great king's imagination, another name is rising. You don't know him yet, but you will. Everyone will. His name is Alexander, but let's not jump ahead. Before that foreign tempest arrives, Bagoas still has work to do. Artaxerxes II is dying. Slowly, but definitely. The court knows it. The priests know it. The royal astrologers, despite their dramatic denials, have been avoiding direct eye contact for weeks. The king, bloated from years of indulgence and haunted by bad dreams, possibly from guilt, possibly from questionable shellfish, is no longer sharp. His decrees ramble, his speeches drift into nostalgia. And his judgment, let's just say it's being outsourced more and more to the man with no title, but every key to the palace, Bagoas. The old king's final months are a blur of half-decisions and whispered retractions. Factions begin positioning themselves for the next reign. You hear the rustle of scrolls that outline claims, counterclaims, accusations. But Bagoas isn't rushing. He's preparing. The heir apparent is Artaxerxes III, also known as Ochus. And if you thought Cyrus was intense, you haven't met this guy. Ochus is ambition dipped in acid. He's known for his brutality, his paranoia, and his tendency to make people disappear faster than a plate of saffron lamb at a palace banquet. Most of the court fears him. Some pretend to like him. But Bagoas, he studies him, watches him, begins sending him gifts. Nothing extravagant, just enough to suggest loyalty, not bribery. A rare scroll here, a foreign chess set there. Ochus, for his part, sees the value. He's ruthless, but not stupid. He knows a good tool when he sees one. And Bagoas, he's the best tool in the shed. Razor sharp, easy to clean, and already soaked in the blood of previous regimes. Artaxerxes II dies in a haze of incense and confusion. His funeral is grand, theatrical, and eerily quiet. No one mourns too loudly. Everyone's afraid to say the wrong thing. And within a week, Ochus is crowned. Artaxerxes III, new robes, same paranoia, He wastes no time. Within months, he launches a massive purge. Royal family members, gone. Disloyal nobles, executed. Potential rivals, convenient accidents. It's like spring cleaning, if your mop was a professional assassin. And somewhere in the middle of this carnage, Bagoas is elevated, not officially. There's no ceremony. But suddenly, his voice carries more weight. His requests get answered faster. He receives his own suite of offices, his own guards, his own seal. He's no longer just the royal agent. He's a power broker. And people begin to whisper again, not in fear, but in awe. Because somehow, impossibly, he has survived another regime change. And not just survived, thrived. But don't mistake this for safety. Bagoas knows exactly how dangerous his position is. Artaxerxes III is unstable, violent, and increasingly suspicious of everyone around him, including the people who helped him get there. Which means Bagoas walks a tightrope now, every step calculated, every sentence rehearsed. He doesn't advise directly. He suggests. He doesn't command. He arranges. He becomes the architect of deniability. And behind every royal order, there's often a shadow in the shape of Bagoas. And yet, something changes. Subtly. Maybe it's the stress. Maybe it's the proximity to another volatile king. But Bagoas begins to harden. He's always been composed. Yes, but now he's colder, less forgiving. You see it in how he handles disobedience. A clerk forgets a minor report, he's reassigned to a border post, known for scorpion infestations. A merchant tries to bribe him improperly. His license is revoked, and his assets confiscated within a week. There's no rage, just consequence. Bagoas isn't playing defense anymore. He's building an empire within the empire, a network of loyalists, informants, functionaries, not out of ambition, out of necessity. Because he knows what happens to people like him when the winds change. Historians still argue whether Bagoas's rise under Artaxerxes III was due to manipulation or mutual dependence. The truth, as always, is messier. They needed each other. Oxus needed someone discreet, intelligent, and utterly efficient. Bagoas needed a king who respected fear more than flattery. Together, they ruled, and Persia, for a brief moment, stabilized. Trade resumed. Temples flourished. Even the rebellious provinces settled down. Partially because they were exhausted, and partially because Bagoas sent them the right kinds of gifts and threats in alternating parcels. But beneath this fragile calm, a new story is stirring. Word reaches the court of a Macedonian general young, audacious, and alarmingly successful. Alexander of Macedon. He's crushed Thebes. He's tamed Greece. And now he's eyeing the east, Persia, the unbreakable empire. Most nobles laugh. The idea of a boy king from the west toppling the great kings of Persia is absurd. Except to Bagoas. He doesn't laugh. He asks for maps. He starts asking questions about Macedonian cavalry formations. He wants names of local satraps near the western borders. He's not panicking. He's planning. And here's the thing. No one talks about. Bagoas is one of the few people in the court who truly understands how empires fall. Not from grand battles, but from missed details. Misread signs, a single traitor, a poorly timed famine, an unpaid army. He sees it coming, not because he's a prophet, but because he knows how the machine works. And when the gears start skipping, he's the first to hear the rattle. And so, on the eve of Alexander's eastern campaign, while the court still toasts to imperial glory. Bagoas is reorganizing grain supply routes. He's auditing provincial reports. He's ensuring that, should the unthinkable happen, he won't be caught off guard. He may not stop Alexander, but he'll survive him, because Bagoas, unlike kings, never bet on invincibility. He bets on information. And as you watch him walk the corridors with his usual composure, scroll in hand, a dozen secrets folded behind his eyes, you realize something chilling while everyone else is preparing for victory. Bagoas is preparing for aftermath. The first signs of collapse don't come with war horns or blood-streaked battlefields. They arrive with silence. Letters stop arriving from the western satrapies. Merchant convoys begin delaying their routes. Temples receive fewer offerings. And inside the court, the king's moods shift like desert winds raging one moment, eerily silent the next. You stand in the shadow of a gold-tiled column and watch Bagoas walk into the inner chamber, unannounced, unhindered, his steps soft, his expression neutral. Artaxerxes III sits slumped on his lion-carved throne, fidgeting with a pearl ring, his beard unkempt, his attendants tense and twitching. He's aging badly. Too many enemies. Too much wine. Too many ghosts. When Bagoas enters, the room changes. The others exhale and quietly excuse themselves. Only one man can speak to the king without fearing for his head, and it's not a priest or a general. It's the eunuch with the soft voice and the ledger full of leverage. You know the rumors. They say Bagoas feeds the king tonics that make him docile, that he slips instructions between the folds of his robes, that he's no longer a servant to the throne, but the hand that moves it. But here's what you actually see: a tired old man who depends on someone with a functioning brain, and that someone is Bagoas. He doesn't flatter. He doesn't dramatize. He reports, concisely, as if narrating the weather. The Egyptian campaign is stalling. There are defections in Lydia. A Macedonian named Alexander has crossed the Hellespont. Each phrase lands like a chisel against stone. Artaxerxes III narrows his eyes, but says little. Maybe he understands. Maybe he's too proud to show fear. But Bagoas sees the cracks, and he knows exactly what to do with cracks. By now, you're aware that Bagoas plays the long game. He always has. But even he seems unsettled. Not panicked, just more precise. He starts sleeping fewer hours, dictates longer notes, meets with more temple officials. He drafts new protocols for emergency grain storage, orders quiet inspections of royal arsenals, and begins revising the palace evacuation routes, all without a single public decree. Because Bagoas doesn't wait for disaster to announce itself. He moves before the lightning, not after the thunder, but even he cannot anticipate what happens next. One morning, before the sun has fully clawed over the mountains, the palace erupts in whispers. The king is dead. Just like that. No dagger, no army, no revolution. Artaxerxes III dies quietly in his chambers. Some say it was illness. Some suggest poison. A few look too long at Bagoas. And Bagoas, he doesn't correct them. He attends the funeral dressed in dark silk, speaks no words, offers no tears. He simply stands near the head of the bier and stares, calm as a river before a flood. Historians still argue whether Bagoas killed Artaxerxes III. Some say yes, citing sudden health decline and motive. Others claim the king was simply old, bloated from years of excess and exhaustion. What's more telling than the cause of death is what happens immediately after. Because instead of chaos, the court sees precision. The king's body is processed within hours. Succession plans are announced without stammer. His son, Artaxerxes IV, is crowned, and Bagoas. He does not retreat. He expands. He becomes, officially now, the vizier, the grand overseer, the shadow king. Artaxerxes IV is young, inexperienced, grateful, and most of all, completely dependent. He leans on Bagoas for every decision. Trade, diplomacy, religious appointments, it all flows through the eunuch's hands. Ministers are appointed with Bagoas's blessing. Satraps pledge loyalty not just to the king, but to the man behind the throne. And for a brief moment, it looks like Bagoas has achieved the impossible. Not just influence, not just proximity, but rule. Real, uncontested, quiet rule. And then, of course, the boy king grows teeth. It always happens. At first, it's small questioning a policy, asking for new advisors, then rejecting a few suggestions, then rumors. Artaxerxes IV begins gathering his own circle, youthful, nationalistic, unscarred by the old wars. They whisper that Bagoas has too much power, that he's a relic, that the empire must be ruled by blood, not shadows. And Bagoas hears it all. Of course he does. He allows it. For a while, watches the young king test boundaries like a reckless cat at a banquet table, until the king tries to dismiss one of Bagoas's closest allies. A fatal error. The message is simple: if the king can remove his tools, then the king can remove him. Bagoas has been patient all his life, but he draws lines, and Artaxerxes IV just crossed one. No trial, no scandal, just a cup of wine, a gift, sent late in the evening. A thank you for the king's continued cooperation. The king drinks. He never wakes. And once again, Persia wakes to a silent shift in power. A king dead. No signs of struggle. No blood. Just the soft echo of Bagoas's footsteps down the marble corridor. And the empire doesn't panic. It doesn't crumble. It obeys. That's the part that chills you. There's no resistance. The satraps don't rebel. The priests don't protest. Everyone just waits for Bagoas to choose the next king, which he does, not with fanfare, but with logic. He names Darius III distantly royal, capable enough, unthreatening, a man who owes everything to the eunuch who placed the crown on his head. But this time, something's different. The people are whispering louder. There's tension in the air. And off to the west, Alexander has entered Asia Minor. The old game is over. This is a new war. And Bagoas, for the first time in years, is dealing with something he can't fully predict. Alexander doesn't play by Persian rules. He doesn't send envoys. He doesn't trade bribes. He marches, fast, decisive, surgical. Satrapies fall like dominoes. Persian generals fail spectacularly. Battle after battle. Macedonian phalanxes cut through Persian lines like fire through silk. And Darius III, he's not Cyrus. He's not Uckus. He's terrified. You find Bagoas in his chamber one night, surrounded by maps. No candles, just oil lamps. The light low and flickering. His face is unreadable, but his fingers tremble slightly as they move across the lines. He's not strategizing anymore. He's triaging. patching, trying to hold together an empire fraying from the edges inward. His power is still vast, but the empire he built it on is collapsing. It's not just military failure, it's cultural shock. Alexander is bringing new gods, new styles, new languages. And Persia. Persia is still clinging to rituals that no longer intimidate its enemies. Still, Bagoas doesn't flee. He doesn't beg. He continues to work. He drafts letters to governors begging for loyalty. He adjusts trade routes to reroute revenue into war funds. He orders temples to pray for Darius's victory. But deep inside, you know he's already preparing for something else. A second life, a pivot, an adaptation. Because if Alexander takes Persia, if this foreign, flame-haired upstart storms the throne, then maybe Bagoas will do what he's always done. Adjust, shift, offer something no one else can knowledge. Loyalty, stability, maybe, just maybe. The boy king from Macedon will find value in the Persian who has outlasted 4 dynasties. And if not, Bagoas has always known how to disappear. You're standing at the edge of something enormous and ancient, and for once, even the palace feels unsure of itself. You can taste the fear in the corridors, in the way generals avoid eye contact, in the way scribes write slower, as if slower ink could delay the inevitable. Alexander of Macedon isn't just invading, he's devouring. Sardis fell like a domino. Tyre resisted, but bled itself dry. Egypt opened its gates without a fight, and now he's heading east, toward the very heart of Persia, toward the bones of kings and the scrolls of prophets. Darius III runs. Of course, he flees from battle to battle, hoping for a miracle, for some fracture in Alexander's pace. There is none. And in the vacuum left behind, guess who's still standing, still operating, still managing the daily mechanics of an empire under siege? Bagoas. He doesn't panic. He doesn't pack. He reviews supply chains, adjusts tax quotas, reminds temple scribes that prayers must still be recorded with the usual precision, even as enemy boots cross their borders. You'd think now, of all times he would collapse, that his web of power would finally snap. But that's the genius of Bagoas. He didn't build his empire on stability. He built it on adaptation, on fluidity. While the nobles scream and flee, while the generals throw tantrums in their tents, Bagoas tightens his circle. He summons his most loyal agents, redistributes his personal fortune, and begins identifying which local officials are most likely to survive a Macedonian occupation. He's not just preparing for a possible defeat. He's planning to make himself essential to the conqueror. Because that's what Bagoas has always done, find the next center of gravity before the old one collapses under its own myth. And then comes Gaugamela, the final shatter point. The Persians outnumber Alexander by hundreds of thousands. Their chariots gleam. Their archers stand in rows like reeds. But it doesn't matter. The battle is a disaster. Darius panics and flees again, leaving his troops to die, to scatter, to surrender. The Macedonians cut through the lines with surgical cruelty. And when the dust settles, the great king is gone. His banners trampled, his army broken. It's not just a defeat. It's a rupture in the cosmic order. The gods, it seems, have changed sides. And Bagoas, he doesn't wait to be summoned. He prepares a delegation, carefully selected, culturally fluent, politically expendable. They ride west with olive branches, tribute, and a message Persia is open to negotiation. Historians still argue whether Bagoas had been corresponding with Alexander before Gaugamela. Some suggest he sent letters months in advance, offering intelligence in exchange for safety. Others claim he held out until the last minute, ever loyal to the royal bloodline. But loyalty, in Persia, was never a straight line. It was a web, and Bagoas was always its most efficient spider. He knew Darius was a dead end. He knew Alexander wasn't just another warlord. He was something new, charismatic, pragmatic, brilliant, and terrifying. And Bagoas, to his credit, understood what kind of man could rule a world and what kind of servant such a man would need. So when Alexander marches into Babylon, triumphant and crowned with dust and destiny, Bagoas doesn't hide. He doesn't send messages through proxies. He goes himself, dressed not as a Persian noble, not as a royal advisor, but as himself eunuch, servant, and master of survival. The meeting is quiet, unrecorded, but echoes loudly through the court. The Macedonians expected fear. Instead, they meet fluency. Bagoas speaks their tongue, praises Alexander's victories, offers scrolls with maps, records, secrets, not flattery utility. Alexander listens. He asks questions. And when the meeting ends, Bagoas is not executed. He is not imprisoned. He is given rooms. He is given access. He is, in short, absorbed. This is not treason. This is transformation. Bagoas doesn't switch sides. He switches systems. Persia is gone, a name with no power. But the machinery, the mechanisms of governance, logistics, ritual, those still matter. And Bagoas is their master. He becomes indispensable once again. He tutors Alexander in Persian court etiquette. He explains temple hierarchies, noble lineages, which priests to flatter and which ones to fear. And Alexander, ever the opportunist, listens. He isn't here to destroy. He's here to become. And Bagoas is the key. The irony is thick enough to bottle. The man who outlived kings, who manipulated thrones, who poisoned a royal line into extinction, is now the quiet advisor of the man who just ended his world. And yet, you can tell there's something more than strategy now. Bagoas is not just surviving. He's almost hopeful. Perhaps because, for the first time, he's advising someone who listens without arrogance. Someone who recognizes his value. There are whispers. Of course. Some say Alexander favors him beyond politics, that they are lovers, that Bagoas is once again seducing power from within. Others scoff, say it's just necessity, that the great conqueror uses whoever he needs. But then there's that scene recorded, oddly enough, by multiple Greek sources of Bagoas dancing before Alexander, performing a sacred Persian rite. The crowd jeers, but Alexander silences them. He walks up, kisses Bagoas, and offers him a golden cup. Not as a servant, as an equal. You don't need to interpret that. You just need to understand what it means. That Bagoas, for all the scars and silences he carries, has found a place not just in power, but in history. And yet, this isn't a fairy tale. The empire is still burning. Alexander's new rule is fresh and untested. Old Persian nobles plot in the shadows. Greek officers resent the Persian influence. There are rumors of mutiny, of tension. And Bagoas, he knows it can all fall apart. Again. But that's the difference now. He's not preparing to flee. He's preparing to build. He begins compiling records, reorganizing administration, training young scribes. He's not trying to outlast history anymore. He's trying to shape it. And so, as Alexander celebrates his conquests with festivals that blend Persian grandeur and Greek showmanship, Bagoas is there, not in the center, never in the center, but just behind, just to the side, where power actually lives. He no longer wears the badge of a Persian courtier. He wears something older, something deeper, the cloak of continuity, the understanding that every empire needs someone who remembers, someone who carries the details, the grudges, the quiet truths. And you, watching from your corner in this strange new empire, understand that you've been following not a footnote in history, but a figure who shaped the rhythm of an age, who transcended labels like servant, lover, traitor. Bagoas is none of these, and all of them. And as the drums of celebration echo across the city, as Alexander drinks from goblets molded in Babylon and dreams of pushing further east, Bagoas watches, not with ambition, not with fear, but with something harder to define, something that might be peace. There are no parades for men like Bagoas, no statues, no epics, no temple festivals where he is praised in song and silk. History doesn't reward the shadows, it absorbs them. But that's fine. He never wanted statues. He wanted access, continuity, the ability to steer the machine while someone else waved from the top. And now, with Alexander seated on the Persian throne, speaking Persian phrases in his Greek accent, and wearing robes dyed in imperial purple, Bagoas finally becomes something else entirely. Not just a bridge between worlds, but their architect. Because what Alexander has conquered, he does not understand. Not truly. Not yet. Persia is not just land. It is ceremony. It is lineage and nuance and grudges so old they've been inherited like property. And so, while the young conqueror dreams of uniting East and West in one grand cosmopolitan orgy of empire, Bagoas does what he's always done. He whispers, advises, smooths the seams with hands practiced in stitching regimes, together with thread barely visible. He starts with the practical, temple logistics, grain reserves, priest appointments. He reviews the tax records that survived the fires, identifies which cities can be restored quickly, which ones are too far gone. He establishes new standards for bilingual scroll keeping, Greek and Aramaic, side by side. He even proposes ceremonial fusions, Zoroastrian processions, where Dionysian musicians provide the rhythm. The nobility balks. The priests mutter. But Alexander, ever obsessed with the optics of harmony, approves. And so, with each parade, each tribute ceremony, each symbolic blending of empires, Bagoas adds another stitch. The wounds are still raw, but the patient breathes. What makes this period so strange is that, for the first time, Bagoas isn't merely reacting to power. He is building something, not for a prince, not for a queen mother, not even for himself, but for an idea. A hybrid empire. Something unprecedented. The Persian court had formality and depth. The Greeks had movement and reason. Together they might actually last. That's the hope. And Bagoas, ever the realist, allows himself that dangerous indulgence hope. He trains younger officials not in how to flatter kings, but how to read economic reports, how to translate prayers across cultures, how to run an empire that speaks in more than one voice. It's not mentorship, it's legacy, even if no one will ever call it that. But hope, as always, attracts enemies. Not just the old guard of Persian nobles who view him as a traitor, not just the Greek officers who scoff at his presence in court, but new ones, subtler ones, those who fear what a eunuch with the ear of a king might become if left unchecked. Whispers grow again, about his influence, his relationship with Alexander, about whether he sleeps in the royal tent or just visits often. Some accuse him of magic, others of manipulation. One Macedonian general refers to him publicly as the snake in silk. He dies in a hunting accident 2 weeks later. No one investigates too deeply. Historians still debate whether Bagoas had genuine affection for Alexander. Was it political opportunistic? Or was there, buried under decades of loss and adaptation, something tender? The sources are vague. They note proximity, trust, gestures. One mentions that Bagoas wept openly at Alexander's bedside after a battle injury. Another describes a quiet moment where the king leaned on Bagoas for support, too exhausted to hold himself upright. Whatever the truth, their relationship is real in consequence, if not in confession, because Alexander listens. And when the most powerful man in the known world listens, reality shifts. But things are not peaceful. Not really. Alexander grows restless. The wars continue. He pushes further east, into lands that barely recognize his authority. Persia is no longer the center. It's just another province in an empire that stretches from the Nile to the Indus. And Bagoas. He follows, not always at the front, but never far behind. He becomes the silent steward of this expansion, translating orders, arranging ceremonies, quietly executing anyone who threatens cohesion. He's no longer the whisper in one king's ear. He's the breath of continuity for a moving world. Then, somewhere near modern-day Afghanistan, Darius III is found, not triumphant, not dignified, but betrayed by his own men, stabbed and left in a cart to bleed out. Alexander finds the body, honors it, buries it with imperial rites, and Bagoas. He watches, expression unreadable, because that corpse was once his king, a flawed one, a doomed one, but a king nonetheless. Maybe he feels grief, maybe just the closing of a chapter. Either way, it's a final severing. The last root pulled from the soil of the old empire. The campaign continues, harder now, bloodier. Alexander grows more distant, his eyes darker, his moods unstable. Some say it's the strain, others, the alcohol. Still others whisper that the gods are punishing him for trying to be more than mortal. And Bagoas. He adapts again, offers fewer suggestions, watches more closely, starts tightening his own circle, because if history has taught him anything, it's this things die. Power doesn't. It just needs a new handler. There's a moment in India rain-soaked and surreal, where Alexander nearly dies from fever. The entire camp panics. Doctors are summoned, sacrifices made, prayers screamed into the storm. And Bagoas. He doesn't weep. He doesn't pray. He takes control, organizes the camp, restricts rumors, quarantines the wine supply. He functions, because grief is a luxury for people who don't run empires. And when Alexander recovers barely, slowly the first person he asks for is Bagoas. But the cracks are showing, not just in Alexander, but in the empire itself. Factions form. Old Macedonian generals resent the growing Persian influence. Alexander begins executing old friends, sometimes for treason, sometimes for looking at him wrong. And Bagoas. He does what he must, cleans the blood, rewrites the logs, replaces the empty chairs with loyalists. He's not blind to what's happening, but he's committed now. This fusion empire is his life's work, and if it's going to survive, someone has to hold it together while the dreamer burns it down. You find him one night, alone in a half-constructed palace near the Indus. The stars are out, the walls unfinished. He's reviewing reports by torchlight. A soft wind lifts his robe. He doesn't look tired, just timeless. A man who has lived too many versions of reality, who has seen too many gods fail, and yet he's still building, still translating, still trying. Because even if no one remembers his name in the centuries to come, the system he shaped might live on. The methods, the resilience, the memory. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all anyone like him can ask for. You can smell it before you see it smoke thick with sandalwood. The scent of garlands crushed underfoot. The dry spice of oil lamps burning without pause. You're in Babylon now, or what's left of it. A city worn down by centuries of kings and cradling an empire straining at the seams. Alexander has returned from the east, victorious but changed. His eyes have a glaze now, not from age but from exhaustion. Maybe from the weight of history leaning too hard on one man's spine. And Bagoas walks beside him like a shadow that's learned to hum lullabies. He's quieter these days, less present at public ceremonies, more focused on what remains unseen, securing grain flows, preventing riots, ensuring temple loyalty. The glory is for others. The function is his. Babylon is a city of ghosts, and Bagoas knows them all by name. He walks its stone streets like someone checking traps, ears tuned not to voices but to silences where a coin used to clink, where a prayer no longer rises, where a guard hesitates just a second too long at the gate. The old Persian elites tolerate him now not because they love him, but because they fear irrelevance more. The Greek generals remain wary, most barely disguising their contempt for the man they think is too close to their golden demigod. But Alexander trusts him, and trust, in this unraveling empire, is rarer than gold that hasn't already been looted. What's strange now is that Bagoas seems more human, not weaker, just less armored. He visits the temples more often, not just to manage records or quiet dissent, but to sit, to breathe. He speaks to no one, watches the fire burn, and leaves before the ashes settle. Some say he's praying, others say he's remembering. You suspect he's doing both. Because the world he helped shape is starting to fracture under the weight of one man's ambition, and even he can't patch every crack. Alexander begins planning more conquests. Of course, Arabia is next, then perhaps beyond. He speaks of blending Greek and Persian nobility, of training a new army of mixed blood, of founding cities that will straddle cultures like chariots on mountain paths. His vision is immense, too immense, and Bagoas sees it how the empire is too thin, the loyalties too shallow, the roots not deep enough to hold. He doesn't argue. He's long since learned that dreamers don't listen. He just prepares, adjusts the budgets, shortens supply lines, commissions new scribes fluent in 5 languages. He's not trying to stop the collapse. He's trying to cushion it. Then comes the wedding at Susa. A great theatrical gesture, thousands of Macedonian soldiers marrying Persian noblewomen, orchestrated by Alexander to symbolize unity. Bagoas organizes it down to the last ribbon. He ensures the rituals are authentic, the wine plentiful, the complaints minimized. He even stands at Alexander's side as the ceremonies unfold, dressed not in mourning black, but in imperial blue, a color he hasn't worn since before Cyrus's death. Some say it was a statement. Some say it was Alexander's order. Either way, the message is clear. Bagoas is not a relic. He's part of the future. And yet, even in this staged harmony, you can feel the tension. The Macedonians laugh too loudly. The Persians bow too stiffly. The unity is a performance, and Bagoas is directing from the wings. Afterward, there's a feast. Sprawling, indulgent, mythic. Bagoas drinks only water. He circulates, nods, smiles, adjusts details. At one point, he pauses beside Alexander, who pulls him into a quiet exchange. No one hears the words. But afterward, Alexander rises and gives a toast, one that includes Bagoas by name. He calls him the guardian of both past and future. The room goes quiet. A few claps, some awkward laughter, but everyone remembers, and everyone understands that when Alexander falls asleep that night, it is Bagoas who checks the locks, who dismisses the servants, who ensures that the conqueror of worlds can sleep without a knife finding his throat. And then the fever comes. Sudden, violent. The physicians don't know what it is. Malaria, poison, divine punishment. Alexander shivers, sweats, mumbles in 3 languages. The court unravels. Factions circle like vultures. The generals begin preparing their own succession plans, some whispering of return to Macedonia, others of seizing the eastern satrapies. But Bagoas stays, every hour. He doesn't leave the chamber. He doesn't eat. He tends to the king himself, wipes the sweat, administers medicine, writes down each shift and symptoms with bureaucratic clarity. The others come and go. He remains. Historians still argue about Alexander's final days. What was said? What was promised? Whether he really named a successor or left the empire to the strongest. But they often leave out one detail, that Bagoas, the last Persian still standing beside the king, heard every word. That when Alexander's breath finally stopped, when his body was still warm, it was Bagoas who closed his eyes, who arranged the room, who instructed the guards, who decided, in those final moments, how a god should die. The funeral is chaos. Everyone wants a peace. The generals quarrel. The satraps maneuver. The body is claimed, stolen, rerouted. Bagoas says nothing. He retires from view. Quietly. No announcement. No ceremony. Just gone. Some say he traveled west with the body. Others claim he stayed in Babylon, tending to temple archives. A few suggest he vanished into the desert, to the estate once gifted by a forgotten satrap. But those who were loyal to him, his clerks, his guards, his spies disappear too, as if he simply dissolved the shadow empire he had built. And here's the part that stings. The world moves on. Quickly, ruthlessly. The empire fractures. Alexandrian generals tear it apart like wolves over a carcass. Babylon declines. The dream dies. And Bagoas becomes a rumor. A line in a scroll. A name footnoted beside a dance and a poisoned cup. No one writes his biography. No dynasty claims him. His legacy isn't statues or oaths. It's the systems that outlasted him. the bilingual records, the administrative reforms, the careful threading of empires that never quite held, but almost did. And you? You're still in the ruins, centuries later, sifting through fragments, looking for proof that someone like him existed. And if you listen carefully, in the dust and the eunuch, you'll hear it, the sound of silk whispering down a hallway, of a scroll being sealed, of someone who wasn't supposed to matter outlasting everyone who thought they did. You stand now in a world without its center. Alexander is dead. His empire, barely out of its swaddling cloth, is already being torn into pieces like a banquet served too early and to the wrong guests. The generals, his companions, his childhood friends, the men who cheered his victories and clinked goblets to his divine right, are suddenly monsters in waiting, carving up provinces like warlords on a looted map. Babylon, once a jewel of cosmic precision, pulses with panic. Markets half open. Priests hedge their prayers. Nobles double-check escape plans. And in the midst of this unraveling, the name Bagoas surfaces again. Not in statues, not on proclamations, but in the coded language of those who understand how power actually functions. Bagoas had a method. Someone says when an administrator manages to hold a city together, Bagoasian patience. Another murmurs as they quietly swap allegiances. He's gone. Yes, but not absent. The mystery grows. Where is he? Did he die with Alexander? Was he poisoned in the scramble for succession? Did he vanish into the mountains with a chest full of scrolls and a list of debts still to be called in? The theories pile up like lost coins at the base of a crumbling statue. But you're not interested in where he went. You're watching what he left behind. Because Bagoas, ever the strategist, didn't need to live forever. He just needed his systems to do so. Take the grain distribution plan he instituted in Persepolis, still in use, even as generals burned the outlying farms, or the temple diplomatic network in Babylon, which now acts like a shadow parliament, keeping riots at bay with nothing but influence and incense. You trace his fingerprints in places that should have collapsed months ago, in scribes who don't panic, in tax systems that don't buckle, in couriers who still know where to deliver messages even though the names at the top keep changing. That's the real Bagoas. Not a man, but an algorithm etched into imperial flesh. He didn't rule with charisma or bloodline. He ruled with memory, with structure. While kings shouted, he whispered timetables. While armies charged, he calculated supply weights. And now, as Macedonian generals rename themselves kings and start building their own little fiefdoms, those who survive aren't the boldest, they're the most boring. The ones who follow his methods. The ones who understand that legacy is not glory, but durability. Still, the rumors persist. Some say he's in Egypt, advising Ptolemy under a new name, hidden among the bureaucrats with clean hands and dirty minds. Others claim he joined the priesthood in Media, shaved his head, and began composing secret histories by candlelight. There's even a tale, probably apocryphal, of a lone eunuch walking into a remote fortress, presenting old documents, and quietly assuming control of the garrison's administration without ever drawing a blade. If it wasn't him, it was someone trained by him. Because that's the thing, Bagoas didn't need children. He had protégés, clerks, assistants, cooks, messengers, people who saw how he worked and mimicked it. Not out of obedience, but admiration, and those echoes carry. One of the new Macedonian satraps in Bactria discovers a set of policies left behind by his Persian predecessor. He finds them efficient, oddly modern, The signature, a single glyph, neither name nor symbol, but unmistakably Bagoas's. Another general in Susa notices that the tax records are still perfectly balanced, despite 3 changes of command. His treasurer, a soft-spoken scribe in his 50s, explains it with a shrug I was taught by someone who served the last king, the one before the last few. The general doesn't press. Too dangerous to ask questions with long answers. Historians, of course, struggle with all this. Bagoas is an inconvenience to tidy narratives, too central to be ignored, too elusive to be summarized. They debate everything: his sexuality, his methods, his loyalty, his very name. Was Bagoas even his original name, or a title adopted through service? Was he truly a lover to Alexander? Or was that Greek dramatization layered over a bond more complicated and more strategic than romance can explain? Did he orchestrate poisonings, or did he simply step in after others had fallen? The record is a cloud, but the consequences are concrete. Scrolls don't lie. Cities that should have burned still functioned. Administrators who should have rebelled kept the peace, not because of divine right, but because someone gave them instructions on how to weather storms that hadn't arrived yet. And here's the secret. Bagoas wasn't exceptional because he was brilliant, though he was. He was exceptional because he was deliberate. Every move had a purpose. Every risk was calculated. He understood people, not in a sentimental way, but like a man who's had to clean up their messes too many times to be surprised anymore. He didn't believe in destiny. He believed in systems, in backups, in leverage. And he used every limitation given to him: his status, his body, his title, as camouflage for power. Even his silence was a weapon. The absence of memoirs, of personal declarations, of great public speeches that wasn't because he had nothing to say. It was because he understood that words were cheap. Actions were ledger entries. And so, long after the kings he served are gone, buried or forgotten, or rewritten, his influence remains. In how courts operate, in how rebellions are preempted, in how loyalty is shaped without loyalty oaths. He built a template for survival, not just for himself, but for empire. And like any good designer, he didn't sign his work. He let it speak. You imagine him, perhaps older now, somewhere quiet, his face unreadable, but his hands still steady. Maybe he's writing something no one will ever read. Maybe he's tending a garden. Maybe he's just watching. He doesn't need to interfere anymore. The empire he helped build is splintering. Yes, but in its fragments. You see him still. Every successful successor who stabilizes their territory is, knowingly or not, following his script. Every palace servant who outlives 3 masters is walking his path. Every child born to a system that still functions, barely, amidst chaos, is breathing through structures he touched. So no, there is no tomb marked Bagoas, no epic poem, no annual festival. But there are cities still standing, networks still running, empires still pretending they invented the systems he handed them like cleaned cutlery. And when the historians come, centuries later, squinting at half-legible scrolls and puzzling over administrative reforms that don't match the supposed rulers' personalities, a few will ask the right question: who really ran things? And then, if they're lucky, they'll find the edge of a name, a whisper, a thread, and follow it into the labyrinth of legacy that Bagoas left behind. Not as a monument, but as a mirror. One that shows what power looks like when it's smart enough not to wear a crown. By now, you understand that empires don't fall in dramatic bangs or theatrical betrayals. They fall like old roofs quietly, slowly, one beam at a time, while the people underneath keep arranging the furniture, pretending the rain is just a passing leak. And in the aftermath of Alexander's death, that's exactly what happens. The furniture gets rearranged, new kings are crowned, new gods are proclaimed, and in every corner of the former Persian Empire, someone is deciding which parts of the past to preserve and which to pretend never existed. That includes people. That includes Bagoas. His name becomes less common in court records. His exact title blurs. His surviving influence, so practical, so present, remains, but without credit. It's almost like the world agrees to remember him just enough to keep using his tricks, but not enough to admit he mattered. Yet the one area where Bagoas's legacy refuses to quietly fold into the bureaucratic shadows is religion. Not faith in the abstract, but the machinery of it. Ritual, protocol, power. Because while philosophers debate meaning and kings forge coins with their own divine profiles, Bagoas had always understood that religion is a lever, not to mock, not to control cynically, but to use carefully. And in the turbulent years after Alexander's conquest, that understanding becomes priceless. You see, Alexander didn't just bring soldiers and statues. He brought reinterpretation, a Macedonian surrounded by Persian customs, being hailed as Pharaoh in Egypt and Shahanshah in Babylon, needed a framework, needed his authority translated across belief systems. And Bagoas, long before anyone realized how fragile that translation was, had begun the process. He wasn't a priest. He wasn't a prophet. But he knew how temples worked. He knew which rituals could be adapted, which doctrines could be whispered through slightly different syllables and still land as sacred. That's why he'd cultivated ties with both Zoroastrian magi and Babylonian astrologers. Not for salvation, for synchronization. Historians still argue whether Bagoas believed in anything. Some say he was Zoroastrian by habit. Others, that he adopted whatever gods were nearest. But belief, for Bagoas, wasn't the question. Utility was. He understood that fire temples and sun deities weren't just for prayer. They were communication hubs, supply chain nodes, identity factories. And so, when Alexander died, and a dozen wannabe successors began carving up territory and scouring the land for legitimacy, it was Bagoas's system that many of them leaned on. His protocols for temple tax exemptions, his policy of dual-language religious edicts, his method of assigning priesthoods to bloodlines with known political loyalty. Some didn't even know they were using Bagoas's methods, but they were, because they worked. The real genius was in the way he blurred the line between religion and policy. In Babylon, temple officials were expected to report civic unrest alongside sacred omens. In Susa, processions doubled as tax audits if the priests weren't being cheered. Something was wrong with the population. In Persepolis, a fire going out during a festival wasn't just a bad omen. It was grounds for reassigning regional governors. Bagoas made belief into a diagnostic tool, like a pressure gauge for imperial stability. And that meant when the empire fractured, those tools remained useful, portable, and dangerously easy to misuse. Take the case of Pathon, one of Alexander's successors. He tried to rally eastern provinces using traditional Macedonian practices, speeches, coinage, heroic statue commissions. Didn't work. The cities were restless. Then he switched tactics. Revived an old Persian festival, appointed local priests, declared himself guardian of sacred fire, and cited Bagoas's old temple revenue-sharing system. Instability dropped within weeks. Coincidence? Sure. And camels invented algebra. Bagoas didn't create religion. He repurposed it, made it multilingual, administrative, durable, and in doing so, he may have preserved more sacred architecture and ritual continuity than any devout monarch ever managed. It's one of the great ironies. The man least likely to be invited into the inner sanctum of faith, too low-born, too political, too surgically altered, ended up being the architect of its survival. And that's why his legacy, even after his name fades, continues to shimmer in the sacred texts rewritten during this period. But not everyone was pleased. Purists hated him, especially Zoroastrian conservatives, who saw his reforms as dilution, compromise, even blasphemy. They resented the way he let foreign rituals creep in under the guise of diplomacy, the way he allowed foreign gods to be mentioned, however briefly, in temple exchanges. They whispered that he was a corrupter, a desecrator. Some even claimed he was cursed, that the reason he had no heirs was divine punishment. But the temple stayed open. The rituals continued. Donations flowed. And so, most priests, even the angry ones, kept using the Bagoasian formulas. Better to curse him from a funded dais than starve in piety. Then there were the Hellenists, Greek purists, who wanted to burn the past and replace it with columns and oracles. They mocked Bagoas's hybrid temples, his cross-cultural festivals, his willingness to adapt doctrine to context. But secretly, they copied him. In Egypt, new Hellenic shrines followed his temple zoning guidelines. In Antioch, administrative offices reused his model of priest-accountant dual appointments. And in every corner of the former empire, the line between sacred and civic blurred not because of a prophet, but because of a planner. Even centuries later, fragments of his systems remained. A tax document from Parthian-era Iran still references ceremonial exemptions from a royal calendar established in the Great Transition. That calendar traces directly back to Bagoas's adjustments to align Zoroastrian festivals with Macedonian military anniversaries. A clay tablet found near Babylon outlines temple grain allotments based on dual seasonal cycles, also Bagoas, and in one fragmentary chronicle, written by a priest who clearly loathed his memory. There's an almost begrudging phrase: he made the gods legible to foreigners, and by that, he stole them from us. That's probably the truest compliment he ever got. You picture him now, near the end, perhaps seated in a temple courtyard, sunlight catching the dust in the air, scrolls spread around him like petals from a withered flower. He's not praying. He's adjusting a schedule, revising a script for the next festival, matching ceremonial dates to agricultural realities. No one thanks him. No one notices. But the temple functions. The fire is lit on time. The priests show up, and the people feel, if only for a moment, that the world still makes sense. And maybe that was always the goal. Not faith, not control, just coherence. A system that doesn't collapse when gods change or kings disappear. A rhythm that outlives conquest. Bagoas didn't want to be worshipped. He just wanted the lights to stay on. By now, the world is full of men pretending to be kings. The corpse of Alexander has barely cooled. And already, the empire he sliced out of history with bronze and charisma is being chopped into petty fiefdoms by generals who once swore oaths over campfires and now plot assassinations over silver plates. Ptolemy takes Egypt and names himself Pharaoh, like it's a party trick. Seleucus grabs Babylon and claims he'll bring order, as if the city wasn't already wheezing under the weight of everyone else's reforms. Each man scribbles a new version of the empire in their journals at night, convinced their vision will outlast all others. Spoiler, it won't. Because they all missed one thing: Bagoas didn't believe in empires. He believed in continuity. And those are not the same thing. You see, a king's job is to conquer. A queen's job, often, is to legitimize. But Bagoas, his job was always structural. He didn't care whose face was stamped on the coin. He cared that the coin retained value, that the grain store matched the temple records, that the priests lit the fires on time, even when no one was watching. And in the brutal scramble after Alexander's death, that mindset proves more valuable than any bloodline. You begin to notice it everywhere. Bagoasian ghosts embedded in newly drafted decrees, in priest appointment manuals, in tax policies replicated without attribution. He didn't leave a rule book. He left muscle memory. That's especially true in the capitals. In Babylon, now a Seleucid stronghold, officials continue using the dual calendar system he created, citing festivals in both Macedonian lunar cycles and Zoroastrian solar rhythms. It doesn't make theological sense, but it keeps the farmers predictable and the temples calm. In Susa, a governor whose loyalty to the new regime is tenuous still insists that any civic proclamation be translated into 3 languages, including Aramaic, a Bagoasian holdover designed to preserve local compliance during rapid transitions. Even in Egypt, where Ptolemy blusters about new dynasties, scribes whisper about a eunuch from the east who made records balance during collapse. But Bagoas didn't just create paperwork. He engineered succession when possible. Remember how he installed Darius III? That wasn't just opportunism. That was damage control. He understood that power was not about loyalty or love. It was about math. How many provinces could be retained? How many generals could be bought or blackmailed? Who would offend the fewest gods with their coronation? And now, without him, the successor states try to copy that calculus, usually badly. A general appoints a cousin with no administrative skills. Another backs a teenage heir with a speech impediment and a messiah complex. The results are predictably disastrous. You get riots, ghost rebellions, regional tax boycotts led by poets. It's not empire, it's amateur hour with crowns. And still, Bagoas lingers not in person, not even in memory, but in the very architecture of governance. In one city, a statue is erected to the unknown official who preserved our ledgers during the fire. In another, a temple dedicates a festival to the silent servant who kept the fires burning. They don't name him. Maybe they don't know. Maybe they're pretending not to. But the silhouette fits. Who else operated silently enough to be forgotten, and precisely enough to still be indispensable? There's a strange case in Ecbatana. An aging priest archivist refuses to retire, citing a promise made to the eunuch who preserved our flame. No one questions it. They just keep funding his scribal staff. In another tale, a young satrap's wife finds a set of instructions hidden inside a ceremonial fan, outlines for handling revolts using temple diplomacy and grain redistribution. She uses them. It works. She never finds out who wrote them, but the handwriting, according to the archivist who later sees it, matches that of the old palace years, a shorthand in records that scholars now believe refers to Bagoas-era reforms. Historians continue to speculate. Was there a secret order? Did Bagoas train a circle of successors in private? Was his influence the result of coordinated mentorship, or simply so efficient that his methods became canon through sheer necessity? The truth is probably both. He trained people, yes, but more importantly, he created templates so effective they became instinct, like a musician who writes melodies so intuitive that others start humming them without realizing they were composed. And that's where the legacy crystallizes. Not in conquest, not in war, but in rhythm, in the repetitive, stabilizing rituals of empire, the tax audit, the temple census, the spring grain count. You'd think that would be the least memorable kind of legacy. But ask any archaeologist today what they find most often in ancient ruins. Not swords, not thrones, tablets, records, calendars. That's where you see his fingerprints. Not carved grandly, but pressed delicately into the clay. A small change in phrasing. A consistent pattern in punctuation. The invisible watermark of someone who understood that the most powerful systems are the ones that don't need reminders. One fragment, found in a ruined temple near modern-day Hamadan, refers cryptically to the shadow who made order. Scholars bicker over the translation. Some say it refers to a deity, others to a generic court official, but the phrase appears only in buildings known to have survived the initial Macedonian purges. Coincidence? Maybe. But you know better by now. Bagoas didn't seek to be remembered. He sought to be needed. And the people who truly change things rarely leave their names in gold. They leave protocols. That's why. Centuries later, a minor Parthian king facing a peasant uprising would still receive advice from a temple priest, citing the old instructions. The ones with the margins marked in green. That's why. When later Islamic bureaucrats revived tax systems under the Abbasids, some of the templates they uncovered in the ruins of Babylon were shockingly functional, so much so that they copied them almost verbatim. They didn't know who Bagoas was, but they knew his work. It was the kind that survived dynasties, because it was never made to flatter a dynasty. It was made to endure collapse. And now, as you stand in the broken shell of what was once a throne room, as wind rattles through stone arches and birds' nest, where ministers once schemed, you feel it the quiet hum of a legacy not designed to impress, but to persist. Bagoas didn't outlive kings to prove a point. He outlived them because he was never trying to be one. He understood something most rulers never grasp, that the people who write history are not always the ones who write their names into it. He just wrote the rules. The poisoned wine doesn't come with ceremony. No dramatic goblet held high. No ominous music swelling in the background. Just a cup, handed at the right time, accepted without question, sipped. And then the silence. Not from shock or betrayal, because by now, silence is Bagoas's language. It's how he communicates that the order has been executed, the threat neutralized, the plan complete. You're not there to see it. Of course, no one is. That's the point. But you know how it plays out. Artaxerxes IV, the boy king Bagoas, once raised to the throne after Alexander's death, had started to make noise. Not much. Just the usual sovereign noises: independence, plans, curiosity. The dangerous kind. The kind that suggests a man might forget where his power comes from. Or worse, think he deserves it. Historians still debate whether Artaxerxes IV actually attempted to strip Bagoas of power. Maybe he was just naive. Maybe he tried to sideline him with a new set of advisors. Maybe he said something foolish over dinner, forgetting that even shadows have ears. But Bagoas wasn't guessing. He never did. He knew before the king did. That's how his kind survives, not by reacting, but by predicting. And when he saw the shape of the future shifting away from his grip, he didn't plead. He didn't threaten. He prepared a cup. It's the same method he used years before. With Artaxerxes III, with countless nobles who crossed invisible lines. That was his signature move, not the executioner's sword. but the steward's tray. A cup of wine, laced just enough. Death not dramatic, but ceremonial. And afterward, order restored. Whispers curbed. Files updated. The machine runs smoothly again. That's how Bagoas kills not for power, but for equilibrium. He's not eliminating rivals. He's pruning systems. Like clipping rotten leaves off a vine to make sure the fruit still grows. You might think this is cruelty, but Bagoas isn't cruel. He's precise. There's no joy in it. No vengeance. Just necessity. The empire, fragmented as it is, still needs rhythm. Still needs someone to care whether the roads are safe, whether the temples stay open, whether the scribes are paid on time. And if that means someone occasionally has to die before they ruin everything, well, so be it. Bagoas doesn't rule with fear. He rules with inevitability. People don't tremble before him because he yells. They do it because they know that once he makes a decision, it's already happened. After Artaxerxes IV's death, Bagoas moves quickly, not to seize power, to contain the fallout. He installs another puppet briefly. The name barely registers in history. Some relative with just enough lineage to placate the nobility, but none of the ambition to be a threat. He doesn't last. There's another cup, and then another. The throne becomes a revolving door, each occupant a little more confused than the last. You'd think Bagoas would be tired of this by now. The endless caretaking of empires that keep refusing to stay stable. But he's not doing it for legacy. He's doing it because if he doesn't, someone worse will. Then something strange happens. Alexander's empire, or what's left of it, begins to fracture so violently that even Bagoas can't predict every fault line. The satrapies start fighting each other. The generals turn into kings, and the kings into despots. The temples beg for neutrality. And in the middle of all this noise, Bagoas, this man who outmaneuvered dynasties, who whispered his way into the bedchambers of empires, finally hesitates. Not because he's afraid, but because the game has changed. The pieces no longer follow rules. The new rulers don't understand systems. They don't value continuity. They just want thrones. And when that happens, when power becomes a firework instead of a furnace, there's no room left for men like him. So he retreats. Not dramatically. No cloaks flung over the shoulder. No tragic monologue. He just stops appearing at court, starts turning down invitations, hands off tasks to his protégés, begins refusing gifts. No one quite notices at first. They're too busy trying to avoid being poisoned themselves. But slowly, his presence fades, like a fragrance that lingers in rooms even after the doors are closed. The policies still bear his shape. The systems still echo his logic. But the man himself gone. You imagine him somewhere on the edge of the empire, maybe in media, maybe in a villa disguised as a monastery, drinking watered wine from a plain cup, watching the horizon with the stillness of someone who's seen every kind of disaster and has run out of new ways to care. He's not bitter. He doesn't curse the kings or regret the decisions. He doesn't expect monuments. That's not what he built. He built instructions, and whether or not his name survives, the people who maintain the wheels of empire will keep using those instructions because they work. There's a story that survives not in official records, but in a letter from a Greek merchant complaining about Persian bureaucracy. He writes about being delayed at a border checkpoint where the guards insisted on verifying his cargo twice, referencing a regulation from the days of the eunuch chancellor. He doesn't name Bagoas, doesn't even know who he's cursing, but that regulation's still working. Years after the king it was written for is dust. Another tale tells of a temple in Persepolis, untouched by fire during a rebellion, because it was known to be under the eunuch's protection. No one knew what that meant anymore, but it was enough to keep it safe. That's the legacy he left: protections that outlast the reason for their creation. And the poison. Let's talk about it, because it's easy to focus on that, on the drama of death. But that's not Bagoas's legacy. The poison was a punctuation mark. The real sentence was the structure he upheld. It wasn't about killing kings. It was about stopping rot before it spread, about ensuring the grain kept moving. The roads stayed open. The people kept believing there was still someone in control, even when everything else burned. If that required a cup of wine now and then, so be it. He didn't kill to seize power. He killed to maintain the illusion that someone still understood how this fragile thing called empire was supposed to work. That behind the gold and incense and titles, there was at least one person who knew where the ledgers were kept. And so, while the world remembers Alexander, carves his name into cities, and mythologizes his horse, Bagoas slips into the silence, not defeated, not disgraced, just done. He outlasted them all, not because he was loved, but because he was necessary. The empire, for a while, made sense because he existed, and that, in the end, was enough. By the time Alexander's funeral cart trundles through Babylon, gold-plated, elephant-drawn, absurdly over-designed, Bagoas is already a memory in motion. Not forgotten, no. Not quite, but no longer mentioned unless someone lowers their voice first. His name has become a kind of passphrase, a shrug with implications, a warning disguised as a compliment. Efficient as Bagoas, they say, when a decree is enforced with surgical grace. More subtle than Bagoas. Someone jokes when a rival goes missing and nobody asks why. But no one says it proudly. They say it like people mention a ghost with a half smile, and eyes scanning the corners of the room. Because everyone understands now Bagoas was never meant to be a main character. He was the script editor who quietly rewrote the story behind the curtain, then burned the draft before the show ended. Meanwhile, the empire Alexander tried to fuse is coming apart, like old papyrus in the rain. His generals, the Diadochi, squabble with the enthusiasm of men who believe history owes them a statue. They split the land, swear allegiances, break them, reform coalitions, betray each other at weddings. There's no vision, just velocity. The machinery of empire. What Bagoas spent his life greasing and maintaining is beginning to jam. And you, as always, are watching from the edge. You see cities renamed only to fall back into local hands within months. You watch temple revenues dry up because the new satrap insists on looting the offering bowls. You hear scribes complain that no one understands the tax codes anymore because the kings keep rewriting them based on dreams. And yet, Bagoas lingers. His protocols survive, not because anyone defends them, but because they still work. In the Seleucid court, new administrators are trained using modified versions of his documentation models. They don't know they're Bagoasian. They just know that if you don't cross-reference grain inventories with temple holidays, riots happen. In Alexandria, a philosopher compiles a treatise on royal governance that quietly lifts phrases straight from a scroll attributed to the eunuch who advised kings. No citation, but the style is unmistakable. Precise, measured, pitiless. And in the East, something weirder happens. You hear about a satrap near the Indus who adopts Bagoas's 3-layer intelligence model public reports, priestly observations, and merchant gossip all funneled into a single advisory council. It's genius. It keeps his province stable for 15 years while the world burns around him. Eventually, someone asks him where he got the idea. He shrugs, says he found it in an old scroll in the palace archive, unsigned but carefully annotated. The ink still smelled of frankincense. The margins had notes in 3 languages. That's the thing. Bagoas never chased credit. He chased functionality. His genius wasn't the kind that wrote poetry or gave rousing speeches. It was the kind that quietly handed a new satrap a corrected version of the imperial calendar, so the grain shipments wouldn't clash with the harvest sacrifices. That kind of genius never gets a parade. But it's the kind that holds a civilization together while everyone else is too busy stabbing each other for the last gold bracelet. So where is he now? If he lived, he'd be old, very old. A man in his late 50s or 60s. Perhaps a miracle in a time where people rarely lasted past 50 unless they were very lucky or very good at ducking arrows and poisons. Maybe he found peace. A villa near the Caspian Sea, a quiet garden, a handful of assistants who think he's just an eccentric retired magistrate. Maybe he spends his days copying old scrolls, correcting translation errors, grumbling about grammar. Maybe he's still watching the empire collapse, muttering, "I told them not to promote that idiot," over tea. Or maybe he died long ago. Not dramatically, just quietly. One morning, he didn't rise. His servants found him seated at his desk, pen still in hand. A list of grain allocations half complete. If so, the empire probably didn't even flinch. That's the nature of good design. It survives its maker. But if you were there, if you had been the one to close his door, tidy his desk, light the incense for his spirit, you'd understand something others missed, that the most powerful man in the room is often the one nobody bothers to look at twice. Bagoas never crowned himself. He never declared a dynasty. He left no heirs. But his fingerprints are pressed into the very language of governance that emerged in the wake of Persia's fall. The way satraps file reports, the way temples manage logistics, the way court officials think about influence not as brute force, but as precision application of knowledge. That came from him. And the irony. The kings who called themselves gods Alexander, Darius, Ocus, they're the ones history remembers with caveats, footnotes, skepticism. Bagoas. He left no statue to deface, no edict to misquote. Just results. There's a moment centuries later, during the rise of the Sassanid dynasty, when a Zoroastrian scribe compiling a sacred text stops to marvel at a peculiar administrative note preserved from the Achaemenid archive. This one's old, he writes in the margin. Strangely practical. He copies it. Not the author's name, just the content. It becomes standard for temple coordination for the next 100 years, and even further down the line. When Islamic scholars begin collecting knowledge from fallen empires and translating scrolls from Aramaic and Persian into Arabic, they find his influence again. Not directly, not quoted, but embedded in the structure of bureaucracy, in the practice of keeping state and sacred duties interlaced, in the method of balancing fear and function. They call it wisdom literature. They assume it came from a school. Maybe it did. A school that once took orders from a eunuch who outlived empires. So what do you call someone like that? Not a king, not a saint, not even a bureaucrat. Really, there's no modern term for a figure so quietly pivotal. Maybe he was the last servant of one empire and the first engineer of the next. Maybe he was just a very tired man who kept doing his job because nobody else knew how. But you're still here, aren't you? Listening, imagining. which means he did something right. Because long after the marble has crumbled and the mosaics have faded, long after the gods are forgotten and the emperors are misquoted, people still want to know who held the pieces together when everything else was breaking. And the answer, whispered through centuries of scrolls and silence, is always the same someone like Bagoas. Here comes the foreign god, again, bronze-plated, blue-eyed, blood-streaked. Alexander, reborn in 20 different languages, all of them half wrong. The stories are swelling now, no longer trying to tell the truth, just trying to stay ahead of the next exaggeration. They say he wept when there were no more worlds to conquer, though the man could barely stop coughing by the end. They say he and Bagoas ruled together like twin stars, though the records suggest more shadows than sun. And they say, most absurd of all, that his conquest marked the end of Persian power. That with one long spear and one even longer funeral procession, he erased what came before. But you know better. You've seen the scrolls. You've walked the halls where priests still burn fire for gods older than Zeus. Persia didn't end. It adapted. And Bagoas, long vanished from the world of power, somehow still shapes what comes next. Alexander's generals, now kings in all but name, have taken his blueprint and turned it into trench warfare. The Seleucids claim Persia. The Ptolemies claim Egypt. Every inch of the empire has been weighed and measured like cattle at market. But none of them can fully rule what they've inherited, because an empire isn't territory. It's technique. And that's what Bagoas left behind, technique. He didn't hand out manifestos or teach charisma. He designed continuity. When the Seleucids failed to hold the eastern satrapies, it's not because they lacked soldiers. It's because they misunderstood the rituals, the order, the tempo. They tried to rule Persia like a trophy, not a system. And in the cracks, Bagoas breathes. Not literally by now. Even the rumors of his survival have quieted, but metaphorically, structurally, like scaffolding beneath a monument that no one notices until it disappears. The rituals he syncretized, the administrative tricks he standardized, the religious diplomacy he finessed into art, those hold steady, while kings kill each other in council meetings. A general in Bactria avoids rebellion by reviving the local temple calendar, copying a festival rotation that first appeared in a forgotten note scrawled in a corner of a document from Susa. A palace in Ecbatana still uses Bagoas's room allocation model for visiting dignitaries. They don't know it's his, they just know it works. And then there's Alexander's archive, the one that followed his campaigns. Crates of scrolls, war journals, religious commentary, troop inventories, all tangled together in Macedonian syntax and Persian practicality. Buried in those is a smaller, tighter packet of documents unsigned, categorized under court operations. They're written in Median, but annotated in Greek. The notes are crisp, unemotional. Timetables for feast days, budget suggestions, risk assessments based on lunar omens and market fluctuations. The scholars who later translate them call them the practical doctrine. They become required reading for satraps. No one ever discovers who wrote them. They simply endure. There's a cynical phrase that appears centuries later in Parthian scribal schools. The gods speak in riddles, but the eunuchs write the manuals. No one remembers which eunuch. It doesn't matter. The idea has crystallized that behind every divine king, there was someone like Bagoas, quiet, clipped, impossible to categorize, and absolutely necessary. The empire may have changed faces, names, alphabets, but its spine, that was his. In Alexandria, where scholars now swim in papyrus like fish in ink, there's a whisper about a text lost in a fire, a treatise on imperial administration written in the style of the eunuch. Scholars argue whether it was a metaphor or a real person. Some claim it was a Hellenistic invention. Others insist it referenced an actual Persian figure whose work had been translated, copied, improved upon, and then erased. His name was unimportant. One writer notes, "What mattered was his method, and that's the truth, isn't it?" That Bagoas's true immortality came not from being named, but from being used, repeated, emulated. Think about how rare that is. Most powerful men are remembered for how they died. Bagoas is remembered for how things continued. His death, if anyone even recorded it, was probably uneventful. No grand assassination, no final vengeance monologue, just a quiet absence. A ledger no longer updated, a clerk's notes that taper off mid-month. But his systems didn't die with him. They entered circulation like currency. They became the water empire drank without thinking. And while stories still swirl around Alexander, his conquests, his lions, his impossible destiny, Bagoas becomes the myth beneath the myth. In one tale, he appears as a trickster spirit who helps a righteous king survive a palace coup. In another, he's a faceless sage who walks into a ruined city and restores it without speaking. No one agrees on the details, but in every version, he fixes things. He doesn't destroy. He doesn't rule. He stabilizes. It's not heroism. It's maintenance. That's what's so subversive about him. In a world obsessed with legacy, he designed for longevity. Not applause, not statues, just continuity. And so, long after the gods change, long after new banners fly over old capitals, Bagoas lives in the blueprints, in the unburned corners of bureaucracies, in every moment when a ruler decides not to kill his priest, or when a tax system doesn't collapse under its own weight. He's the reason order doesn't completely fail when power does. So when someone says, "Bagoas fell for a prince," you nod, because maybe he did. Maybe he loved Cyrus, or Alexander, or no one at all. Maybe his love was reserved for infrastructure, for the quiet thrill of knowing a city ran smoother because of a note he slipped to a scribe 10 years earlier. Romance is messy. Spreadsheets are eternal. And if you think that's cold, remember this love that saves a kingdom isn't less real because it wears a ledger instead of a ring. You're still listening, after all this time, because part of you understands that history isn't made by the loudest voices. It's made by the ones who answer the letters, who balance the accounts, who survive one more regime change because someone needs to know where the keys are kept. Bagoas was that someone. And the fact that you're still here, tracing the outline of a life never meant to be recorded, means he did more than survive. He succeeded. There are no heroic busts carved in Bagoas's likeness, no grand temple where pilgrims kneel and whisper his name to the wind, no tragic opera where tenors bellow his story in gilded robes. And yet, if you squint hard enough through the dust of history, you start to see his silhouette stitched between the ruins, not in marble, but in margins. A footnote in a treaty, a tax code that survived 3 dynasties, a festival that no longer remembers its own inventor. That's where Bagoas lives now in the software of empire, not its hardware. While kings sought statues and gods demanded prayers, Bagoas invested in what no one else had the patience for function. And because of that, you see echoes of him in the strangest places. A Roman magistrate in Antioch uses a 4-tiered auditing model, almost identical to the one first implemented in Persepolis during the final years of the Achaemenid court, when Bagoas was still a rising clerk with perfect handwriting and a terrifying memory for grain metrics. Centuries later, a Byzantine scribe records a method for allocating temple funds based on predicted calendar cycles, a method considered quaint but mysteriously effective. No one claims authorship. They just say it's old. That's how Bagoas survives, not by name, but by necessity. He wasn't trying to be remembered. He was trying to make things work, and the difference matters. Because most historical figures you've heard about, emperors, rebels, prophets, they burn hot and brief. Bagoas is the ember that doesn't go out. He didn't write speeches. He wrote templates. And while orators get applause, templates get reused. That's the paradox of legacy. The louder you chase it, the quicker it runs. Bagoas did the opposite. He shrank from attention, disguised his fingerprints, trained others to act in his stead, and let results speak louder than rumors. You don't build an immortal bureaucracy by stamping your name on everything you build it, by making sure nobody can tell where you started and the system begins. It's harder than it sounds. Most people crave recognition. Bagoas weaponized obscurity. It gave him freedom. It let him outmaneuver kings, outlive regimes, and most crucially, outlast memory. Some say this made him cold, detached. Others call it brilliance. Either way, the proof is in the aftermath. As the Seleucid Empire rises and stumbles through its awkward attempts to blend Persian governance with Hellenistic aesthetics, it leans heavily on systems Bagoas either designed or inspired. Not consciously, maybe, but instinctively. His ideas had a half-life longer than marble. That's what genius looks like when you stop caring about statues. And even though his methods endured, the stories around him began to blur. He was too slippery for a proper biography, too influential for complete omission. So they made him into myth. The Greeks painted him as a decadent court favorite, all eyeliner and poisoned goblets. The Persians remembered him as a whisperer, maybe even a traitor. Later poets turned him into a tragic romantic figure, draped across pillows, heartbroken over Alexander's indifference. All of them missed the point. He wasn't a lover. He was a lever. And in every court where power trembled but didn't collapse, where transitions happened without bloodbaths, you'll find a ghost of his style, a report written in triplicate, a marriage arranged between rival clans at the last possible moment, a feast held not for joy, but for stability. Bagoas wasn't interested in ideals. He was interested in outcomes. Justice was someone else's job. He handled continuity. That's why, when the Seleucids eventually crumble under their own weight, the fragments that function longest are the ones that adhered closest to his model, the ones that preserved temple-state collaboration, the ones that trained mid-level clerks rather than just bribing generals, the ones that understood that loyalty isn't owed, it's engineered. If you make people's lives predictable, they'll let you rule them. And if you forget that, you'd better hope someone like Bagoas is still on staff. There's a legend, completely unprovable, but oddly persistent, that in the city of Nisa, centuries later, a group of scribes uncovered a cache of documents hidden inside a crumbling column. They expected decrees. What they found were notes, meticulous, handwritten, multilingual, operational strategies for temple management, water taxation, festival scheduling. The edges were brittle, the ink still faintly fragrant. The final page, supposedly, ended with a line in median. If this reaches hands that can still read, remember, power fades, structure persists. Whether or not it's real doesn't matter. It feels like something he'd say. And if that sounds too grand, remember Bagoas's genius wasn't in vision. It was in application. You don't need to believe in empires to manage one. You just need to know when the roads need repairs, when the priests need their bribes, and when the boy king has started asking too many questions about autonomy. That's not charisma. That's logistics. Bagoas was a logistical god. You sit with that for a moment. You imagine the empire not as a sweeping saga of battles and romances, but as a long, slow balancing act, grain against rebellion, ritual against revolution, whispers against declarations. And at the heart of it all, a man with no children, no claim to the throne, no army to command, just the ability to keep things from falling apart. You've seen history try to erase people like him before, the ones who hold the lantern while others take credit for the path. But they never really disappear, because someone, eventually, stumbles on the system, dusts it off, uses it, and when it works, they look up, confused, and wonder who was the first to do it this way, and there he is again. Bagoas. A whisper, a pause in the sentence, the part of the story that didn't need a spotlight, because it never stopped performing. It's almost a trick of the light. The way Bagoas dissolves into the folds of time like parchment buried too long under palace floorboards. Still intact, but unread. Still present, but unspoken. He isn't just forgotten, he's transformed. What once was a name is now a method, a structure, a series of habits baked so deeply into the operating system of governance that even centuries after his death, rulers adopt his approach without knowing who wrote the blueprint. That's the final stage of influence, isn't it? Not when people chant your name, but when they follow your steps without realizing there was a path to begin with. You can trace the outlines in the Seleucid embers, in the Parthian gears, even in fragments of Sasanian tax law. It's always subtle a line item for temple subsidies matching a ratio first implemented in Susa, or an odd insistence on bilingual edicts echoing a policy Bagoas initiated when Persian elites began marrying Greek officers. There's one fragment, preserved by chance in a legal scroll reused to wrap a mummy's hand in Egypt, that outlines a method for calming urban protests by rotating priestly festivals with rationed wine allowances. The scribe who copied it calls it the Old Calendar Compromise. Bagoas's name isn't mentioned, but his logic is obvious soothing with structure. Managing with myth. You think back to all the kings who outshouted their enemies, who built cities in their own names, who died thinking they'd carved eternity into the face of the world. And yet here you are, watching their empires rot and their statues crumble, while Bagoas, who never sought glory, still shapes the choices of people who've never heard of him. That's the catch, isn't it? The more you demand to be remembered, the less likely it is. But if you work quietly enough, precisely enough, your absence becomes architecture. By the time the Roman world collides with the Eastern dynasties, scholars from both sides begin exchanging administrative models. Some Roman officials are baffled to find near-identical census forms in Persian territories. A few even joke that there must have been a divine administrator, a forgotten god of bureaucracy who wandered between courts writing ledgers instead of laws. One senator writes sarcastically in a letter to a colleague, "We found a ghost who files better than half our prefects." It's meant as a dig, but it might be the most accurate summation of Bagoas's legacy ever written, because what he left wasn't culture, it wasn't war. It was something far rarer: coherence. In a time when empires rose and fell faster than a caravan's wheel could complete a turn, he made things make sense. And that sense, however tenuous, survived. Through coups, betrayals, cultural upheaval, divine rebranding, and administrative whiplash. He wasn't beloved. He wasn't admired. But he was indispensable. And indispensable people don't vanish. They become protocol. In modern times, scholars still fight about him. There are entire symposiums dedicated to the Bagoas problem. Was he a lover or a manipulator? A traitor or a loyalist? A Persian traditionalist or a multicultural pragmatist? Some argue he was the last true Achaemenid. Others call him the first modern political operative. But all of them agree on one point: he was necessary. Without Bagoas, the transition from Darius to Alexander to the Diadochi would have bled far worse than it did. Without him, the administrative glue holding the old empire together would have melted on contact with Greek ambition. And you, still curled in bed, half asleep now, can feel that necessity settling over you like a weighted blanket. You realize this story wasn't really about power, not in the way we usually define it. It wasn't about conquest or bloodline or charisma. It was about maintenance, quiet mastery. A man who held the world together with routine and silence. Who knew that survival was its own kind of resistance. That being overlooked was a form of freedom. That you don't have to wear the crown to choose who gets it. He didn't crave love. He curated influence. He didn't want revenge. He wanted the grain ledgers to match the warehouse records. He didn't write poetry. He wrote policies. And in doing so, he ensured that while kings might fall, order didn't have to. And so here, at the end of this long road, you're left not with a statue, but with a system. Not with a battle, but with a blueprint. Bagoas, the forgotten architect of empires, the eunuch in a world obsessed with heirs, the shadow behind the throne who became the only part of it that didn't collapse. That's the kind of legacy that never needs to shout. It just waits and survives. And now, let it all quiet down. The palaces, the thrones, the voices, fade them out. Let the scrolls settle. Let the marble cool. Let the names of kings fall silent, like footsteps absorbed by thick carpets in a room that hasn't been opened in years. You're still here, still breathing steady, still wrapped in the warmth of a story you didn't expect to carry you this far. A story not about glory, but about the soft persistence of structure. The way one man, never meant to be remembered, built something stronger than memory. Picture Bagoas again, just one last time, not in his youth, not at court, not in power, but in peace. Maybe he's in a sunlit garden, tracing his fingers over the spine of a scroll too old to read, letting it rest in his lap like a cat. The world he helped hold together is changing again, but he doesn't fight it. He doesn't fear it, because he knows what's meant to endure, endures, and what isn't, burns itself out. The room you're in now is calm. The lights are low. The hum of the fan spins soft in the background, like wind through old cypress branches. There are no speeches here, no swords, just breath, just rest, and the slow, sure understanding that the quietest legacies are often the most resilient. So close your eyes now. Let the past soften. Let the empire dissolve into starlight. Let Bagoas, the man who never needed a crown, whisper you to sleep with the one thing he offered the world that no one else could continuity. Good night, traveler of shadows. Sleep deep and dream of quiet architects. End of script. Sweet dreams.